In the religious world of ancient Mesopotamia, the most powerful gods of the pantheon were believed to maintain a sacred partnership with a human representative on Earth. This role was fulfilled by a high priestess known as the En. Once chosen for this position, the priestess dedicated her entire life to the service of the deity. She lived within the temple complex and carried out rituals that symbolically maintained the bond between the divine world and the human community. Although the details of daily life inside the temple of the goddess Inanna remain largely unknown, clues from archaeology and surviving texts allow a partial reconstruction of the lives of the women who served in these sacred roles. Important information comes from the city of Uruk, where the residence of the priestesses, called the Jipa, stood beside the great temple of the moon god. Additional evidence comes from archives discovered at Sippar along the Euphrates, where thousands of clay tablets from the early 2nd millennium before the Common Eras record the activities and organization of women living in a temple cloister. The office of the end priestess in Ur held exceptional prestige throughout Mesopotamian history. This status can already be seen during the Akkadian period, when the famous king Sargon appointed his daughter Enheduanna as priestess of the moon god Nanna. Later, dynasties continued this tradition. Rulers of the 3rd dynasty of Ur and the kings of Isin and Larsa regularly selected royal daughters to occupy the same sacred office. The position was the highest role within the temple hierarchy, connected with the Gipa. Archaeological discoveries from the cemetery of Ur reveal cylinder seals belonging to individuals who served these priestesses. Some belonged to officials connected to Enheduanna herself, while others came from attendants who served her successor Enmanana, the daughter of Naram-Sin. These seals depict scenes of presentation before a divine figure and include inscriptions identifying scribes, couriers, and other temple personnel attached to the household of the priestess. Every Enno priestess received a ceremonial name when she entered the temple service. Scholars have reconstructed a sequence of these names, stretching across several centuries. Most of these names include the element An, which could refer either to the concept of heaven or to the ancient sky god An. Among them were Enheduanna, whose name means High Priestess, Ornament of Heaven, and Enmanana, whose title may be translated as Crown of Heaven. Others followed across generations. Priestesses appointed by rulers of Lagash, Ur, and Isin carried names that expressed divine favour, legitimacy, or heavenly authority. Through these ritual names, the priestesses assumed a sacred identity that marked their separation from ordinary society. The residence of these priestesses lay just southeast of the towering ziggurat dedicated to the moon, god Nanna. The ziggurat rose within a large, sacred courtyard surrounded by the buildings of the temple complex. At certain festivals, the statue of the god may have been brought into the open courtyard so that the citizens of the city could witness the presence of their divine protector. Nearby stood the administrative centre that controlled the temple's wealth and economic activities. Large storerooms within this area held goods belonging to the temple treasury. The Jipar itself was an imposing structure measuring nearly 80 metres on each side. Its walls were aligned with the cardinal directions and enclosed a fortified compound that functioned both as a residence and as a sacred institution. Excavations revealed that the building was divided into several sections connected by internal corridors and courtyards. One part of the complex served as the temple household of the goddess Ningal, the divine wife of the moon god. The priestess lived in close association with this goddess, whose presence was represented by a cult statue placed in a sanctuary chamber. Before entering sacred spaces, priests were required to purify themselves, and therefore basins coated with bitumen were installed near entrances for ritual washing. Within the sanctuary, the statue of the goddess stood upon a raised platform, while nearby rooms stored the food and offerings prepared for both the divine household and the human residents of the complex. Another section of the building contained the large dining hall, where ceremonial meals took place. The room was accessible through several doorways and appears to have been a central gathering place for rituals connected with the gods of the temple. Nearby lay the burial area reserved for the priestesses who had served there in previous generations. Archaeologists discovered several tombs within this cemetery, some empty and others containing remains of those who once held the office. Because the priestesses did not marry or bear children, the responsibility of maintaining their funerary offerings passed to their successors. Each month, food, drink, and other gifts were placed before the graves, so that the memory of the deceased would be preserved. The northern part of the complex functioned as the private residence of the reigning priestess. Her living quarters were arranged around a central courtyard similar to those found in domestic houses throughout Mesopotamia. Within this area, there was also a chamber dedicated to the ancestors of the priestess, where prayers were offered for the health and prosperity of her father, the king. Statues of earlier rulers of once stood in these rooms, along with images of protective deities associated with the royal family. Artistic remains from the early 2nd millennium provide an impression of how these priestesses appeared. Their clothing followed a traditional style already seen centuries earlier. Sculptures depict them wearing elaborate garments with layered woolen fringes and a distinctive band across the forehead, sometimes fashioned from gold. One surviving statue portrays the priestess, Inanna, seated on a high ceremonial chair, dressed in the characteristic robe that symbolized her sacred authority. Small sculpted heads discovered near temples in and Assur may also represent priestesses of this rank. Even though these objects are modest in size, their careful craftsmanship suggests the reverence associated with these women. The appointment of a new priestess was not a private event, but a public ceremony of great importance. Kings even named official years after the installation of a priestess, emphasizing the significance of the occasion. Once installed, the priestess normally remained in office for life. Even when political power changed hands, rulers rarely removed a priestess who had been appointed by a predecessor. This continuity shows how deeply the position was embedded within religious tradition. Evidence from inscriptions reveals the presence of scribes and attendants working within the household of the priestess. One seal impression records the service of a scribe who identified himself as the loyal servant of a priestess named Inanna. The image on the seal shows a figure approaching an enthroned deity in a gesture of reverence. Such scenes were common in Mesopotamian art and symbolized the relationship between a servant and a divine or royal authority. After the collapse of the 3rd dynasty of later, rulers attempted to preserve the tradition of the priestess. However, the political stability that had supported the temple institutions gradually weakened. Wars, economic hardship, and shifting centers of power eventually damaged the city itself. Even so, the custom survived for a time under the kings of Larsa. In this later period, the office was sometimes given not to a king's daughter, but to his sister. One of the last women to hold the position was a princess named Inanna. She entered the Jipar during the reign of the Larsa dynasty, but would ultimately become the final priestess to serve there before the city fell to the Babylonian king Hammurabi. An inscription left by Inanna provides a rare glimpse into the responsibilities of the office. In this text, she describes the state of the temple complex when she first arrived. The walls had fallen into disrepair, vegetation had grown across the sacred grounds, and the protective boundary around the cemetery of earlier priestesses had been neglected. Determined to restore the dignity of the institution, she ordered the rebuilding of the structures, the clearing of the grounds, and the reinforcement of the enclosure that guarded the burial places of her predecessors. She also arranged for the continued care of the sanctuary and the preparation of offerings dedicated to the divine couple, Nana and Ningal. The priestess oversaw not only ritual activities, but also the administration of lands and resources belonging to the temple. She organized offerings of bread, beer, grain, and meat that were presented daily before the divine statues. She also commissioned new garments and jewelry appropriate for the dignity of the gods, and arranged for furnishings within the sanctuary, including ceremonial beds used in religious rites. The process by which a woman was chosen for this sacred office involved divination. Priests interpreted signs found in the organs of sacrificed animals, believing these signs revealed the will of the gods. When the divine choice became clear, preparations began for the elaborate ceremony that marked the entrance of the new priestess into the Jipar. Ritual purification formed an important part of the event. Sacred hymns were recited, and the priestess formally received her ceremonial name, which defined her role within the temple. One ancient hymn associated with these ceremonies praises both the moon god Nana and his divine partner Ningal, while describing the duties of the priestess. The text portrays the priestess preparing offerings, performing ritual tasks, and singing praises within the sanctuary. She grinds grain used for sacrificial meals and carries ritual objects connected with the temple service. These actions symbolize the care she provided for the divine household. The priestess was regarded as the earthly representative of the goddess, who was the divine spouse of the temple's god. Because of this symbolic relationship, she devoted her life entirely to the deity rather than entering into an ordinary human marriage. In this sense, her role resembled later religious traditions in which women dedicated themselves to spiritual service. Through ritual acts, prayers, and offerings, she maintained the connection between the god and the city that depended on divine favor for prosperity and protection. During the early centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era, a new kind of religious institution became visible in several Mesopotamian cities. Enclosed communities of women attached to the cult of a major god. For many wealthy households, placing a daughter inside such an institution was not a temporary phase. It was a lifelong arrangement. The most widely known example stood in Sippar, a city on the Euphrates where the great sanctuary of the sun god was served by a walled women's quarter. Behind that wall lived women who were set apart from ordinary marriage and ordinary family life, yet who remained closely tied to property, contracts, and the social ambitions of the families that sent them there. These women were known by a title that later readers often translate as consecrated women, but in their own world the label carried a more specific meaning. The term has been explained in different ways. One interpretation connects it to the idea of land left uncultivated, as if a woman in this role was expected to remain, without children and without sexual life, set aside like a fallow field. Another interpretation links the title to the language of giving and marriage, suggesting that such a woman was, in a symbolic sense, given to the god and treated as a spouse dedicated to a heavenly husband. Whatever the original linguistic path, the practical expectation in Sippar was clear. The woman entered a defined religious status, lived under special rules, and did not form a normal household through marriage. The complex in Sippar functioned like a small town inside a wall. It contained streets, gates, and a clear internal organization. Individual women could own or rent separate houses, and many ran their own households with the help of servants and enslaved workers. The enclosure also included the residences and workplaces of the officials who kept the community functioning: gate supervisors, doorkeepers, administrators, and legal authorities who handled disputes, and oversight. Specialized labor was present as well, including women who worked as weavers and cooks. There was storage space for grain, offices for administration, and areas that appear to have been used for record keeping. Even a modest plot of cultivated land existed within the enclosure, where sesame could be grown. This was not a silent retreat cut off from the economic world. It was a managed institution with routines, property, personnel, and constant paperwork. The administrative head of this community carried a title that can be rendered as a steward of the consecrated women. In the earlier phase, women from the community themselves could hold leadership responsibilities. Over time, however, a noticeable shift occurred. Positions of formal authority that had once been accessible to women increasingly moved into male hands. Records also show the presence of female scribes in Sippar, but the role was limited, and later it seems to have been dominated entirely by men. This gradual change says something about how institutional power could narrow even within a system where women were central to the identity of the place. Entry into the cloister typically occurred at the age when a young woman would otherwise have been expected to marry. Surviving tablets preserve the practical details of admission, and they read less like mystical ceremonies, and more like the careful accounting of a major life transaction. One record describes a girl brought to the enclosure by her brother. The list of items and expenses includes food provisions, oil, silver, jewellery such as rings, and pieces of clothing and accessories. The same record even notes costs linked to travel and transport, suggesting that the journey into the enclosed quarter was treated as a formal transfer that required logistical planning. The language used for some of these expenses resembles the language of betrothal gifts. That detail matters because it frames the entire entry as a kind of marriage arrangement, not to a human husband, but to the divine household served by the institution. In several cases, the administrative body connected to the cloister appears to have offered gifts comparable to bridal presents, reinforcing the idea that a family was not simply donating a daughter, but negotiating a recognized social and economic exchange. Admission could also be linked to festivals. Some tablets note multi-day celebrations connected with the cult of the sun god, including offerings presented in honor of deceased women who had previously lived in the enclosure. In at least one account, even the distribution of beer to the enslaved women serving the new entrant is carefully recorded, as if the institution marked the occasion with regulated hospitality. The entrance of a new member was therefore not only a private family decision, it could be tied into the calendar of public cult life. Behind the religious language stood a hard economic logic. In the second millennium, a growing number of upper-class families managed to accumulate estates, houses, and movable wealth on a scale that encouraged strategic planning across generations. Marrying off a daughter meant transferring a dowry out of the natal household. That dowry could weaken the family's long-term concentration of assets. By placing a daughter in the cloister instead, a family could preserve its holdings more tightly. The woman still possessed a dowry during her lifetime, but after her death it could return to her brothers or remain linked to the original family line. In addition, the family might receive valuable gifts tied to the woman's entry, similar to what a family might receive in a conventional marriage arrangement. This made the institution attractive, not only as a religious path, but as a tool for managing inheritance and preventing fragmentation of wealth. There was also prestige in closeness to a major god. Having a daughter living near the temple, making offerings, and praying within the sacred sphere could be understood as a spiritual advantage for the family, a daily investment in divine favour. Letters from women in such positions show that they viewed themselves as symbols of their family's devotion, and at times they demanded that their families treat them accordingly. The same logic could apply even in royal contexts. In unstable political environments, sending a potential rival or vulnerable royal woman into a protected religious status could function as a strategy of survival, removing her from the dangerous contest of succession. Yet, the emotional reality could be brutal. The institutional wall protected the women, but it also separated them. Letters reveal loneliness, resentment, and a sense of abandonment. Some women complained that despite their high status, they were neglected in provisions and treated worse than captives taken in war. Complaints mention shortages of money, oil, clothing, and basic support. A woman could describe days filled with tears or the loss of household help through illness and death, and then use those hardships as an accusation directed at her own family. In these messages, a sharp contradiction appears. The woman is presented as spiritually important, yet materially vulnerable if her relatives fail to uphold their obligations. Within the cult structure of Sipar, these women were framed as secondary partners in the divine household of the sun god. The god's primary divine spouse held the highest symbolic place, and the consecrated women were imagined as belonging to that same sacred family. Their relationship to the goddess connected with the sun god was especially emphasized. This can be seen in the ceremonial names many women received upon entering the cloister. Names that repeatedly incorporated the goddess's name and described devotion, belonging, goodness, or being called by her. Such naming patterns were not casual. They created an identity that anchored the woman to the goddess as mistress and patron, and they marked her as someone whose life was now defined by divine service, rather than ordinary kinship. Despite isolation, life inside the enclosure did not mean total silence or total separation from the outside world. Tablets show active correspondence with relatives, friends, and commercial agents. Women could send instructions, request goods, complain, negotiate, and maintain networks. There is also evidence suggesting that visits were possible under certain conditions, because letters sometimes refer to the joy of seeing a relative again, describing it as comparable to the first moment of entering the enclosure and encountering the face of the goddess. The line between enclosure and world was controlled, but it was not always absolute. Religious obligations, however, appear surprisingly limited in the surviving documentation. These women did not necessarily perform elaborate daily rites in the way that some high priestesses did in other cities. Instead, a key duty was participation in offerings during particular festivals. For those events, a woman was expected to bring an offering to the temple of the sun god. Payment could come from the family or from the income of the woman's own property. This duty could become a point of tension in family relationships, and records even suggest that failure to supply clothing, ointment, and festival offerings could lead to severe consequences within adopted family arrangements. The expectation was clear. Sacred status carried practical obligations, and neglect could be treated as a serious breach. Most women remained within the enclosure until death. Many, therefore, lived there for decades, commonly between a quarter century and more than half a century. The enclosed life reduced certain risks that shaped ordinary women's lives in the ancient world, especially the dangers linked to repeated childbirth. Isolation could also reduce exposure to contagious illnesses. Paradoxically, the same institution that produced deep loneliness for some women may have contributed to long life for many. Rules demanded chastity, but human life rarely matched rules perfectly. Some documents strongly suggest that a number of women in this status did bear children. The evidence appears in legal agreements, where a woman arranges for her child to be adopted by a brother or by another household, sometimes while still providing nursing care in exchange for a set allowance. What stands out is that these contracts do not always treat childbirth as an automatic end to the woman's religious status. The institution appears to have handled such cases pragmatically, at least at times, focusing on the legal and economic arrangements rather than public scandal. Economic life is where the records become especially vivid. Some women amassed considerable wealth, including large property holdings, managed through supervisors and agents. Lending money at interest, leasing land, and hiring out labour were not unusual activities. Enslaved workers could be treated as part of an economic portfolio, rented out or used to maintain household production. Not all women had such resources, but even women of moderate means could participate in contracts involving houses, land parcels, and the purchase and sale of enslaved persons. Some earned money through textile work, spinning and weaving wool, and records exist of women using that income to make significant purchases. The enclosure was therefore not merely a spiritual space. It was embedded in the economy of the city and helped shape property flows across generations. The legal system recognized that this arrangement could place women in a precarious position. Because the woman did not marry into another household, her relationship to her natal family remained central, and conflicts over dowry, inheritance, and support were common. Legal provisions from royal law collections attempt to protect temple women by defining their rights to use their dowry and by limiting the ability of brothers to block access to it. In practice, however, the same laws often positioned brothers as managers of the dowry, which could easily become a channel for neglect or exploitation. The very existence of repeated protection suggests that the problem was not theoretical. It was persistent enough that rulers felt pressure to intervene more than once. The enclosure did not provide full financial support. Even though the women were attached to a major temple, they were often expected to live on private resources, family remittances, and income from property. Tablets preserve moments of genuine panic, where a woman urgently begs relatives to send grain or essential goods, sometimes framing the request as necessary for an offering. These letters show fear not only of poverty, but of failing in the religious obligations that defined the woman's status. When families abandoned their responsibilities, the consequences could be severe. Because of this vulnerability, some rulers issued direct orders to ease the situation. One policy allowed a woman to leave the enclosure if her family stopped supporting her, acknowledging that the institution could become a trap if the economic bargain collapsed. Another principle aimed to protect these women from being held liable for their parents' debts and obligations, a crucial safeguard in a world where family financial crises could spread through kin networks. These interventions paint a picture of a system that was admired, used, and yet often strained by the realities of money and family conflict. When a woman lacked reliable support, adoption became a survival strategy. Some adopted a son or daughter who could provide care in old age, creating a contractual family where biological family failed. The adopted person might be another woman from within the enclosure, a relative, or even a loyal enslaved worker. In some cases, adoption contracts promised freedom to an enslaved person after the woman's death, creating an incentive for lifelong service. Sometimes the institution itself helped arrange care for a sick woman with no one to assist her, requiring an adopted caretaker to provide nursing and long-term support. These contracts show a stark truth. Spiritual prestige did not guarantee practical security. Security had to be negotiated, written down, and enforced. After the era of Hammurabi, this particular class of women gradually disappears from the record, and the economic and social world tied to their institution fades with it. The disappearance was not just a religious change. It also meant the loss of a distinctive economic actor. because these women had played an active role in property markets and lending networks. Against this backdrop of temple institutions and women's religious status, the wider divine landscape of southern Mesopotamia remained dominated by the great gods of Ur. In Ur, the moon god stood at the center of civic identity. His cult shaped hymns, rites, and expectations tied to fertility and the rhythms of time. In the older mythic memory, the goddess Inanna and the sun god were described as children of the moon god, but hymns dedicated to the moon often focus instead on his own power and his relationship with his divine spouse. Over centuries, partnerships among gods could shift in emphasis, and traditions that once linked a goddess to one divine partner could later highlight another. What remained stable was the moon god's image as a force of renewal and abundance, a presence believed to influence the well-being of fields, herds, and kings. Royal names reveal the importance of this deity in political ideology. Many kings incorporated the divine name into their own, turning it into a marker of legitimacy and divine favour. For Amorite dynasties that rose to power later, devotion to the moon god may have carried echoes of older lifeways on the steppe, where the moon's cool guidance across night landscapes had a different emotional weight than the harsh sun of daytime travel. In that worldview, the moon could be imagined as a leader moving with a host of stars across the sky, like a herdsman guiding animals across a vast pasture. In Ur, the moon god's principal temple complex included a famous ziggurat that became one of the great monumental symbols of Mesopotamian religion. Kings celebrated building works dedicated to this god and his spouse, presenting themselves as pious servants who poured libations and offered gifts to secure divine protection. The god's name itself carried layers of mystery. Scribes used different spellings and titles, some emphasizing lordship, others emphasizing brightness, motion, or solitary radiance. Even in antiquity, learned tradition could admit that the oldest meaning of the name was obscure, as if the god's identity had travelled through languages and cultures before settling into the forms preserved in later texts. The moon's changing shape inspired a rich vocabulary. Names and epithets reflected waxing light, crown-like brilliance, and the rhythm of renewal. The moon could be compared to a dragon in its roaring majesty, not only as a frightening creature but as a symbol of supreme power. It could also be compared to a bull, the crescent imagined as a horn, and divine radiance described as a shining aura. In artistic imagery, bulls decorated with precious materials could mirror the same symbolic language, linking earthly wealth to heavenly brightness. Pastoral metaphors dominate the praise of the moon god. The sky becomes an enormous animal pen. Stars and planets become herds. Fixed stars move like disciplined animals, while wandering planets behave like restless sheep, crossing the sky with their own pattern. The moon becomes shepherd, bull, and source of milk-like abundance poured onto offering tables. Hymns imagine endless cattle, endless milk, endless butter and cheese, tying cosmic order to the daily substances of human survival. This is not poetic decoration alone. In an agricultural world where prosperity meant full pens and full granaries, these metaphors made the god's power tangible. The moon's cycle also shaped time. Certain days of the month were marked by temple festivities tied to visible phases of the moon. At month's end, the moon's disappearance could be treated like a descent into the underworld, a moment for offerings of mourning. Its return was celebrated as rebirth and renewal, the beginning of a new cycle. When moon and sun appeared together in particular positions, that moment could be considered especially potent. Ritual instructions sometimes focused on these alignments, prescribing offerings, incense, and spoken formulas meant to harness the combined strength of the heavenly lights for healing. In such rites, the sky was not distant astronomy. It was a living schedule of power. The moon also touched the most intimate human experiences, including childbirth. In later traditions, hymns about divine animals, bulls and cows, were used in healing contexts, recited by ritual specialists when assisting a woman in painful labor. The logic followed a common magical principle. What happens among the gods can be echoed in the human world through spoken narrative and ritual imitation. By calling on the moon, god who eased the suffering of a divine cow, the healer sought the same easing for a human mother. Even personal names could reflect gratitude for successful births, linking the child's identity to the god's aid. Fertility symbolism extended into the cult of Inanna as well. She could be addressed with bovine imagery, and certain small reliefs show cows in sacred contexts that may represent divine presence or general fecundity. In a world where cattle represented wealth, survival, and the continuity of life, the cow became a natural emblem of blessing. Many goddesses could receive that epithet, and some divine names themselves carried the meaning of wild cow or great lady, suggesting how closely fertility imagery was woven into theology. Love songs dedicated to the moon, god and his spouse, often resemble the style of sacred love poetry elsewhere in Mesopotamian tradition. The goddess speaks of dwelling with the god in specific holy places, describing storehouses rich with sweetness, quays where sacred boats dock, and elevated shrines imagined as fragrant, cedar-scented heights. Dialogue texts portray desire, food preparation, butter, milk, and the movement of cattle into pens, turning domestic imagery into divine intimacy. These songs likely belonged to ritual settings, where the union of god and goddess symbolized abundance for the land. The moon god's importance was also political. Kings sometimes described themselves as specially connected to him, even as his offspring, and royal participation in temple festivals could reinforce the idea that the ruler's well-being and the land's fertility were bound to the god's favor. When the moon god travelled in sacred narrative to visit a higher deity in another city, the journey could mirror political hierarchies. A city god paying respect to a supreme figure, bringing offerings and receiving blessings in return. Such divine journey stories are filled with lists of animals, foods, and rich cargo, and they imagine the river route as a procession of sacred hospitality, with cities welcoming the traveller and trying to persuade him to stay. The god refuses because the journey has a higher purpose, a destination tied to cosmic order and the distribution of blessing. But Mesopotamian literature also preserved a darker memory. Prosperity was never guaranteed. The end of the third dynasty of Ur became the subject of long lamentations that describe catastrophic collapse in terms that feel both historical and cosmic. In these poems, destruction is not merely an enemy victory. It becomes a decision embedded in the order of the gods, as if the very laws of the world have turned against the city. Temples are abandoned, storehouses fall silent, quays silt up, cattle are taken, daily offerings cease, the city's king is portrayed as isolated and grieving. The language piles image upon image, ovens cold, butchers' knives idle, songs turn to weeping, sacred halls defiled, the ordinary sounds of abundance replaced by silence and dread. The poems describe storms and floods sweeping over the land, obscuring daylight, scattering bodies and leaving roads to brigands. Some interpretations treat these storms as metaphors for invading armies, foreign forces that devastated the cities at the end of Ur's power. Others read the storm imagery more literally, suggesting that natural disasters, such as flood, drought, famine, or epidemic, contributed to the collapse, and that invasions followed when the region was already weakened. Either way, the literature frames the catastrophe as the death of an era, not merely a political transition. The language is vast, relentless, and mournful, insisting that what was lost was not only a city, but a world. Within this grief, the goddess spouse of the moon god becomes a central witness. She cries over the ruin, describes herself as exiled, stripped of a home, sitting like a stranger in a strange city. She laments that those unfamiliar with silver seize silver, those unfamiliar with gems wear gems, as if the sacred wealth of the temple has been scattered into the hands of the unworthy. She tears at her hair, beats her chest, and repeats the sorrowful refrain for city and house. The poems describe her pleading with the highest gods to spare the city, prostrating herself, stretching out her hands, begging that the fate be changed. The refusal she receives is presented as final and terrifying, a decree that cannot be undone. The Lamentations also list what has vanished from religious life: purification rites, priestly garments, music, festivals, offerings of cattle and sheep, fish and birds, the bustling work of temple personnel. Even the landscape changes. Plants grow in waterways once busy with boats. Thorn bushes rise on roads built for wagons. This is the poetry of absence, where every missing routine becomes a wound. At times, the text shifts into a call and response style, as if a chorus demands to know how long the misery will last, how long the singing will remain weeping, how long the sacred economy will remain broken. In the end, the literature offers different kinds of closure depending on the composition. Some traditions allow a hint of rebuilding and renewed blessing. Others end with abandonment, the gods turned away, the city never fully returning. Historically, did not regain its former glory after the Old Babylonian period. The memory that survives is therefore not only of temples and hymns, but of a city whose identity was bound to the moon god and whose fall became a symbol of how fragile human prosperity could be under forces that seemed, to ancient minds, both political and cosmic. 5,000 years separate the modern world from the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia. Bridging that distance requires imagination. The people who lived in those distant centuries experienced a universe that looked completely different from the one explained by modern science. Today, it is understood that the Earth is a rotating sphere orbiting the Sun, tilted in space in a way that produces the changing seasons. The Sun itself is recognized as a massive sphere of burning gas, whose energy makes life possible on this planet. Planets such as Venus are known to follow their own paths around the Sun, governed by gravity and physical laws. Weather, disease, and famine are explained through natural processes, rather than the anger of invisible beings. For ancient societies, none of this knowledge existed. The sky, the seasons, and the disasters of life appeared mysterious and unpredictable. Yet people still searched for explanations. Their response was to imagine a universe filled with divine personalities and supernatural forces. Gods, spirits, and demons became the framework through which the workings of nature could be interpreted. Storms, illness, fertility, or prosperity could all be understood as the actions of these unseen powers. Stories about the gods, therefore, became much more than entertainment. Myths offered answers to the deepest questions communities faced. They explained how the world began, how human beings came into existence, and why death eventually claims every life. Some stories described how agriculture first appeared, or how tools such as the plough were introduced into human society. In these narratives, the origins of civilization itself were placed in the hands of divine beings. Ritual practices formed the practical side of this worldview. Ceremonies allowed communities to respond to the forces they believed shaped their existence. Through carefully repeated actions, people attempted to influence events, or at least place them within a hopeful interpretation. Rituals were performed generation after generation, preserving collective memory and reinforcing the belief that cosmic order could be understood and maintained. Myths did not function like scientific explanations. They spoke to emotional truth rather than empirical fact. They addressed how the world felt rather than how it could be measured. Rituals then brought those stories into everyday life. When communities reenacted sacred actions that had been performed for centuries, they created a powerful sense of continuity. The shared performance of these traditions strengthened social bonds and offered reassurance in a world that could be harsh and uncertain. Within this mythological landscape, the goddess Inanna occupied a central place. Many of the stories connected with her were attempts to explain unusual events observed in the sky. In very early times, Inanna was closely linked with the planet Venus. The unpredictable behavior of that planet fascinated ancient observers and was interpreted as the visible movement of the goddess herself. Venus travels around the Sun more quickly than Earth. From the perspective of someone standing on Earth, this creates an unusual pattern of appearances. At certain times of the year, Venus rises shortly before the Sun and shines brilliantly in the eastern sky. In those periods, it becomes known as the morning star. At other times, Venus appears after sunset in the western sky, glowing brightly as the evening star. For long stretches, Venus remains visible in one of these positions. Eventually, it disappears entirely for a period before returning again on the opposite side of the sky. To ancient observers, this cycle appeared mysterious. The planet sometimes seemed to move backward against the background of stars before changing direction again. Such behavior seemed erratic and difficult to predict without long observation. Modern astronomy explains these movements through the geometry of planetary orbits. Venus travels closer to the Sun than Earth does, so it is always seen near the Sun in the sky. When Venus lies between Earth and the Sun or passes behind the Sun, its light disappears in the brightness of daylight and it cannot be seen. Only when it moves to the side of the Sun from Earth's perspective does it become visible again, either before sunrise or after sunset. In ancient Mesopotamia, these disappearances were interpreted in mythological terms. When Venus vanished from the sky, it was believed that Inanna had descended into the realm of the dead. Her eventual return symbolized her reappearance among the living world. One of the most famous stories describing this cycle tells of her journey to the Underworld. Another important narrative connected with the goddess tells how she acquired the mysterious powers known as the ME. These were understood as the fundamental principles that shaped the structure of civilization. They included both the creative and destructive aspects of human society, from political authority and religious offices to craft traditions and social behaviors. Originally, these powers were believed to belong to the god Enki, the divine patron of wisdom, whose sacred city was Eridu. According to tradition, Enki kept these cosmic principles in his hidden residence beneath the waters of the Abzu, the subterranean source of fresh water believed to flow beneath the earth. The story describes Inanna deciding to travel from her own city of Uruk to visit Enki in his watery domain. The reason for the journey is never fully explained, a typical feature of ancient myths, where divine actions are often mysterious. Before departing, she adorns herself and prepares to use all her charm and persuasive abilities. Enki learns of her approach long before she reaches the city. From his palace, he orders his servant, Izimud, to greet the arriving goddess with generous hospitality. She is to be welcomed with food and drink and treated as an honored guest. Soon the two deities sit together sharing beer and wine. The mood becomes increasingly relaxed, and eventually Enki grows intoxicated. In that state, he begins offering the ME to Inanna one after another. Each time he declares that he is granting these powers to his daughter. The list of ME is long and varied. Some represent institutions such as kingship, priesthood, and the authority of rulers. Others describe skills such as metalworking, writing, construction, and craftsmanship. Still others refer to human experiences including conflict, celebration, wisdom, and deception. Together they represent the many forces that shape human culture. Inanna quietly gathers these powers and stores them aboard her divine boat. When Enki finally awakens from his drunken sleep, he realizes what has happened. Alarmed, he demands to know where the ME have gone. His servant explains that the goddess has already departed with them. Enki sends messengers to retrieve the boat, but each attempt fails. Whenever the pursuers reach Inanna, she insists that the gifts were freely given and cannot be taken back. Eventually, the goddess reaches her own city of Uruk. Her arrival brings immense celebration. The possession of the ME promises prosperity and prestige for the city. Music fills the streets, animals are sacrificed in honor of the gods, and the people praise their divine protector. The end of the story is damaged in surviving texts, but it suggests that the myth may have been connected with a festival celebrated in Uruk. The narrative may have explained why certain rituals required processions or symbolic journeys between cities. Some interpretations suggest that the story reflects the celestial movements of Venus. The repeated journeys between Uruk and the watery realm of Enki could mirror the planet's cycle of appearance and disappearance in the sky. The goddess rises, disappears, and returns again, just as Venus alternates between visibility and invisibility. Another myth connected with Inanna and the planet Venus tells of a gardener named Shukalatuda. This story begins with the goddess travelling across the world, inspecting the lands beneath her. After a long journey, she becomes exhausted and rests beneath the shade of a tree in a garden. The gardener sees the mysterious figure lying there and realizes that she possesses divine power. During the brief moment while she sleeps, he commits a grave act of violence against the goddess. When she awakens and discovers what has happened, she is overcome with rage. Unable to find the attacker immediately, Inanna sends disasters across the land. Wells fill with blood, storms sweep across fields, and the roads become blocked. Each calamity spreads fear among the population. Meanwhile, the terrified gardener seeks advice from his father, who urges him to hide among the crowds of the city where the goddess might fail to recognize him. For a time, the plan succeeds, but eventually Inanna consults Enki for help. With his assistance, she locates the guilty man. The surviving text breaks off during the description of his punishment, but it is clear that the gardener is condemned to death. Yet the goddess declares that his name will not vanish completely. Songs will remember him, and his story will be sung by shepherds and musicians long after his life has ended. Scholars have proposed different ways to understand this strange narrative. Some see it as a political allegory reflecting historical tensions between cities or empires. Others believe it again reflects the movement of Venus in the sky. In this interpretation, the goddess's disappearance corresponds to the planet vanishing from sight near the sun. Her return represents the moment when Venus reappears in the dawn sky. The gardener's encounter with the goddess may symbolize the brief interval between her disappearance and her renewed visibility. Ancient astronomers observed the heavens with remarkable dedication. They carefully recorded the rising and setting of Venus and other celestial bodies. Over time, they began linking these observations with events on Earth such as harvests, political conflicts, or natural disasters. These records eventually formed long series of astronomical observations. If a particular appearance of Venus had coincided with a prosperous harvest in the past, the same event might later be interpreted as a favourable omen. Conversely, the disappearance of Venus could be taken as a warning of danger or misfortune. Farmers also paid attention to celestial signs. Agricultural instructions advised observing the constellations before beginning important seasonal work. The timing of ploughing, planting, and harvesting was believed to depend partly on the patterns visible in the sky. Venus held particular importance because it was associated with fertility and abundance. Its appearance after a period of invisibility could be interpreted as a promising sign for crops and livestock. In divination texts, the planet's position within certain constellations was sometimes connected with predictions of rain, successful harvests, or political stability. Within the myth of the gardener, these celestial beliefs may appear symbolically. The field where the goddess rests could represent a constellation associated with agriculture. Her presence in the garden would normally signal prosperity for the land. Yet the gardener violates the divine order by attacking the goddess. Instead of bringing fertility, he brings disaster. The story may therefore warn against misusing divine power or ignoring sacred boundaries. Another possible interpretation connects the myth with ancient fertility rituals. In some traditional farming cultures, people believed that human actions could magically stimulate the growth of crops. Couples sometimes spent nights in fields during certain seasons as part of ceremonies meant to encourage fertility in the soil. If such practices once existed in Mesopotamia, the gardener's encounter with the goddess might reflect a distorted or forbidden version of this ritual. Only certain sacred figures, such as priests or rulers, could properly participate in divine unions meant to bless the land. For an ordinary person, the attempt would be dangerous and sacrilegious. Whatever its original meaning, the story ends with the gardener's death and the promise that his name will survive in song. The narrative closes with the suggestion that even tragic events can become part of cultural memory. Through storytelling and ritual, communities preserved these myths and passed them down across generations. Agriculture stood at the heart of life in ancient Sumer. Every year, the survival of entire communities depended on the success of the next harvest. Fields had to produce grain, orchards had to bear fruit, and herds had to multiply. Yet this foundation of life was fragile. A poor harvest could threaten the stability of a city, and the forces that determined success or failure seemed unpredictable. Rain, floods, drought, and disease could change everything. Because of this uncertainty, people believed the outcome of the harvest ultimately depended on the favour of the gods. Farmers tried to secure that favour through prayers, offerings, and rituals. Songs and hymns expressed the anxieties of agricultural life as well as the hope that divine powers might ensure abundance. In these songs, the growth of crops and the increase of animals were often described through the imagery of human relationships. Fertility in nature was imagined in the same terms as the union between a man and a woman. Certain religious figures may have performed rituals meant to guarantee prosperity for the land. But ordinary villagers also believed their own actions could influence the forces of fertility. Through symbolic acts and celebrations, they attempted to imitate the creative power of nature itself. Among the many deities who were connected with fertility, the goddess Inanna occupied a special place because she embodied the principle of sexual generation and renewal. In poetic language, the goddess often described her own body using images drawn from agriculture. In one lyric song, she compares herself to land that has not yet been cultivated, a field waiting to be ploughed and made productive. The imagery combines desire with the rhythms of farming life. My uncultivated land lying in the steppe, my field where birds gather in great numbers, my well-watered ground rising like fertile soil, my own body like a field filled with moisture. Who will plough it for me? Who will guide the ox across this fertile earth? Another song expresses a similar idea in even clearer language. Inanna invites her lover to treat her as the fertile ground itself. Do not dig a canal, I will be your canal. Do not plough a field, I will be your field farmer. Do not search for wet ground, I will be the ground you seek. These songs survived only because scribes eventually recorded them on clay tablets. But they must have existed for centuries before being written down. What remains today is only a small fragment of what once circulated among the people. They were originally connected with wedding celebrations that involved entire communities. Villagers gathered to sing, dance, and reenact the union of divine lovers whose relationship symbolized the renewal of nature. In these traditions, the goddess Inanna is paired with Dumuzi, a shepherd who becomes her beloved partner. Their relationship is not presented as an ordinary marriage, but as the moment of courtship that brings fertility to the land. The songs focus on longing, attraction, and the anticipation of union rather than on married life or children. The emphasis remains on the immediate impact their relationship is believed to have on crops, animals, and the prosperity of the countryside. Dumuzi appears in these traditions as a shepherd rather than a farmer. In reality, both occupations were essential to Sumerian society. Farmers cultivated barley, vegetables, and flax in irrigated fields near the villages. Sheep and goats, however, required larger grazing areas, so shepherds led their flocks out into the open steppe, where water and pasture could still be found. This division of labour created a complicated relationship between farmers and shepherds. Farmers sometimes regarded the pastoral life as rough and uncivilized, yet they depended on shepherds for wool, milk, and meat. The economy of Sumer required cooperation between these two groups, even when tension existed between them. This contrast appears clearly in a well-known song describing how Inanna chooses her future husband. At first, the goddess shows interest in a farmer named Enkimdu, who represents the cultivated fields. He grows barley and flax and promises to provide her with fine garments. Inanna's brother, however, favours the shepherd Dumuzi and praises the quality of his flocks. The debate between the two men unfolds through poetic dialogue. Dumuzi defends his profession by describing the richness of his animals and dairy products. If the farmer gives me his dark cloth, I will give him my dark ewe in return. If he offers me white cloth, I will give him a white lamb. If he pours me strong beer, I will pour him sweet milk. If he offers brewed drink, I will give him fresh butter after he eats and drinks his fill. There will still be milk and butter left over. In the end, the rivalry dissolves. The farmer and the shepherd recognize that both occupations are necessary for prosperity. The farmer even invites the shepherd to graze his animals on the good land near the village, while Dumuzi welcomes him to the wedding feast. The story suggests that the strength of Sumerian society depended on cooperation between agriculture and pastoral life. Another song continues the narrative by describing preparations for the wedding itself. Inanna asks who will prepare the flax needed for her wedding garments. Her brother promises that he will arrange each stage of the process, from beating the fibres to spinning the thread, weaving the cloth, and bleaching it until it is ready. Yet Inanna asks one final question that reveals her true concern. Who will lie beside me? The answer is simple. Her chosen bridegroom will share her bed. In that moment, the goddess finally expresses her joy at the coming union. He is the man who speaks to my heart. Without working the fields, he gathers grain in abundance. Storehouses fill with harvest. His sheep carry thick wool. These songs preserve another interesting feature of Sumerian culture. In many of them, the speech of the goddess appears in a special form of language associated with female voices. This form differs in pronunciation and vocabulary from the everyday language used in administrative texts. It appears frequently in laments, songs, and rituals, connected with goddesses or female figures. The romantic songs about Inanna and Dumuzi were probably performed during seasonal festivals. Groups of singers responded to each other in alternating lines, accompanied by drums and stringed instruments. Young women may have represented the role of the goddess during these performances, while the chorus echoed the dialogue of the lovers. One lively scene describes Inanna wandering outside during a day of celebration. While she dances and sings, the young shepherd approaches her. "Yesterday, as I passed the day, singing from morning until evening, the Lord met me, the companion of heaven embraced me, set me free so that I may return home." What excuse shall I tell my mother? Dumuzi quickly provides a solution. She should simply tell her mother that she spent the day dancing with friends and playing music. Meanwhile, he invites her to remain with him under the moonlight, where they can continue their meeting in secret. In the following verses, Dumuzi approaches Inanna's household formally, standing before the entrance to ask her mother for permission to marry. Inside the house, the goddess moves excitedly from room to room while preparations begin. "Let someone inform my mother. Let the neighbor sprinkle water on the floor. The house fills with fragrance. The words spoken inside are joyful. The bridegroom arrives, carrying gifts of animals, and produces symbols of wealth and prosperity." The celebration continues with music, dancing, and songs praising the abundance that the couple will bring to the land. The imagery of fertility appears constantly in these lyrics. Gardens bloom, orchards bear fruit, and vegetables grow in watered soil. Sweet syrup flows from dates, and honey becomes a metaphor for pleasure and prosperity. It flourishes like lettuce in a well-watered field. My garden in the open land blossoms richly. My barley rises beautifully in its furrows. My apple tree bends under its fruit. My beloved sweetens me like honey. His hands are honey. His feet are honey. His whole body brings sweetness. Another series of songs raises the question of social status. Some lines suggest that Inanna might be marrying below her rank by choosing a shepherd, rather than a more prestigious figure. She even reminds Dumuzi that without the support of her powerful family, he would wander the dark paths of the steppe alone. Dumuzi answers confidently, listing members of his own family who are equal in dignity to the gods of Inanna's household. By doing so, he places himself on the same level as the divine relatives of the goddess, and demonstrates that their union is appropriate. At one point, he promises to prepare precious ornaments for her, described poetically as shining stones that will adorn her body. Some scholars believe these lines may symbolically describe acts of intimacy, comparing the threading of jewels to the sowing of seeds in cultivated soil. The songs do not avoid describing desire openly. In one poem, the goddess recounts how her lover met her during a journey and brought her to his house. "He led me inside. He placed me on a couch sweet as honey. My beloved with beautiful eyes embraced me again and again. I stood trembling beside him." The final lines hint that the lover must return to the palace afterward, suggesting that the figure of Dumuzi may also reflect the role of a king. In royal ceremonies, the ruler sometimes identified himself with the divine shepherd, symbolically reenacting the union between the goddess and her beloved in order to secure fertility for the kingdom. Another song presents a playful exchange between a man and a woman in a tavern. The man praises her beauty and the quality of the drink she serves, comparing her eyes and lips to blossoming gardens and fragrant orchards. Before allowing the relationship to proceed, the woman demands an oath from him. "Your right hand must rest upon me, your left hand upon my head, your mouth close to mine, your lips touching mine. In this way you will swear your promise." Such imagery illustrates how ancient poetry blended ritual language with playful intimacy. Many metaphors drawn from gardens, trees, and precious stones carried symbolic meanings related to human relationships and fertility. Over time, The tone of these compositions changed. Later versions from the second millennium sometimes use more direct language and appear less refined than earlier courtly songs. Some may have served magical purposes or popular entertainment, rather than royal ceremony. Not long after the wedding songs fade into memory, the story turns dark. In the tradition about Inanna and Dumuzi, happiness does not settle into ordinary married life. The shepherd husband meets a violent end, and the myths linger on the shock of that loss. One major narrative follows Dumuzi's final hours through a nightmare that arrives like a warning, while another places Inanna at home, waiting for a man who will never return. Dumuzi is first seen leaving for the open steppe, his staff balanced across his shoulder, moving as if he already senses what is coming. He cries as he walks, weighed down by dread, as though the protection of the city has fallen away behind him. The landscape around him becomes a witness. He calls out to the marshlands and the riverside creatures, to frogs and crabs in the reeds, begging that if he dies, someone will carry the news to his mother. The fear is not only of death itself, but of what follows. Without proper burial and offerings, the dead are left stranded. Dumuzi worries that no one will tend his memory, that his name will be cut off, that he will be abandoned in the emptiness beyond life. Exhausted and shaken, he finally lies down and falls into sleep, only to be seized by a dream so terrifying that he wakes in panic. His first instinct is to call for his sister, Inanna, because she's known as someone who understands the language of dreams. He demands that she be brought at once. And as soon as she reaches him, he pours out the vision in broken, urgent images. In the dream, rushes rise up again and again, as if something is pushing through the earth to surround him. A lone reed shakes its head at him like a silent warning. Twin reeds appear, then one is torn away from the other. In the forest, tall trees loom together above him, closing in like walls. Water is poured over his sacred coals, killing their glow. The lid of his churn is lifted away. His drinking cup is torn from the place where it hangs. Even his shepherd's staff vanishes, as if his authority and identity are being stripped from him. Then the signs turn into violence. A night bird carries a lamb out of the sheepfold. A falcon snatches a small bird from a reed fence. Goats drag their dark beards through dust, and rams scrape the ground with heavy legs as if the animals themselves are restless with grief. The churns lie on their sides and no milk is poured. Cups lie overturned. The dream ends with a sentence that lands like a verdict. Dumuzi is dead, and the sheepfold has become a haunted place. Inanna listens in silence, frightened enough to hesitate. The meaning is too clear, and speaking it aloud feels like sealing it. But she finally interprets each symbol with painful precision. The rushes are attackers rising from hiding. The single reed shaking its head is his mother mourning him. The twin reeds separated from one another are brother and sister about to be torn apart. The trees that rise together are the men who will trap him, closing in like a wall. The water poured over the coals means the fold will become silent, emptied of life. The churn's lid being removed means intruders will handle what is sacred. The cup torn down signals a fall from safety and from the arms that once sheltered him. The vanished staff means the forces coming for him will destroy what marks him as a shepherd and a leader. Even the animals become part of the forecast. The stolen lamb is a first blow. The hunting falcon is a greater power descending. The overturned churns and cups mean death and disorder, and the haunted fold points to captivity before the end. Hands and arms bound, movement taken away. When she speaks about the goats dragging beards in dust and the rams scraping earth, her interpretation turns into a vow of mourning. Her hair will whirl like a storm for him, and her nails will tear her cheeks as if she were cutting with a needle. The dream is not just a prediction. It is a map of grief. The urgency becomes immediate. Dumuzi tells his sister to climb a mound and keep watch, but not as a calm observer. He insists she must behave like a mourner already, tearing at clothing and flesh in the gestures of lamentation. It is a desperate plan, almost a trick, as if visible mourning might convince enemies they are too late. Yet the demand also feels like surrender to the inevitable. While Dumuzi still lives, the rituals of his death begin. He warns her what to look for. Men carrying binding wood and prisoner ropes, the tools of capture in their hands. Soon she sees them approaching over the water, arriving by boat. A companion beside her cries that the powerful men who bind necks are already coming. Inanna calls down to her brother to hide, to press into the grass, to sink into ditches. Dumuzi answers that he will drop down into the ditches of Arali, a word that can describe the wild steppe and also the underworld itself, as if the place of hiding is already shaded by death. Inanna swears she will never betray him. Her oath is fierce and grim. If she gives him away, let his own dog devour her, the black shepherd dog, the noble dog, the dog of the household. A friend of Dumuzi is asked to swear the same oath and does so with identical words. Both promises carry the same threat. Betrayal would make them fit only for animals. The identity of the friend remains unclear, but his role becomes decisive. The pursuers arrive like a mixed band of terror. They are described with the chill features of beings who do not live like ordinary people. They cannot be bought with gifts. They do not delight in embraces. They do not kiss children. They do not eat the foods that mark normal life. They move with the cold certainty of a duty that cannot be negotiated. Yet the story also names them as men from specific cities. Men who come for a king. Dumuzi, the shepherd, is treated as royal prey. The fear they inspire resembles the fear communities feel toward those who seize people by order, those who take bodies away without mercy. They try first to crack loyalty. Inanna is grabbed and offered bribes, but she rejects them with contempt. No one, she insists, has ever truly known a sister to betray a brother. Then the pursuers turn to Dumuzi's friend and offer him land and water, promises of wealth that would tempt a desperate person. This time, it works. The friend gives away the hiding place, though he speaks as if trying to soften the betrayal, as if uncertainty could cleanse him. Dumuzi has dropped into the ditches, he says, though the exact place is unclear. It is enough. When Dumuzi understands what has happened, his face drains of colour. He says his sister saved his life in the city, but his friend caused his death. The net closes. The pursuers twist cords and weave a rope hawser. Sticks are cut, the tools of restraint prepared. Missiles fly from front and back. Cornered, Dumuzi turns to the sun god Utu, calling him brother-in-law, reminding him of family ties and past service. He speaks of carrying food and gifts, of kissing sacred lips, of dancing on Inanna's knees, trying to anchor himself in the bonds that once brought joy and legitimacy. Utu answers by transforming Dumuzi's hands and feet into those of a gazelle, giving him speed and escape. Dumuzi runs to a distant place with a name that sounds like a spell, a location removed from ordinary maps. The pursuers lose him briefly, then decide to follow, and the chase repeats like the pattern of a folktale. Again he calls on Utu. Again the transformation returns, and again the net tightens. During one escape, Dumuzi reaches the house of an old woman named Belili. He begs for water and food, and the request sounds like the rites performed for the dead. Water poured, flour scattered, simple offerings meant to sustain a spirit. Belili provides what he asks. But when she steps outside, her behaviour gives everything away. Her fear and her cries draw attention. The pursuers notice her trembling and conclude she must know something. They break in, seize Dumuzi, bind him, strike him again with missiles, clamp him in handcuffs and fetters. The story never clearly explains why the pursuers want him so badly, or why his fate is treated as unavoidable. It also overturns expectations of heroic myth. Dumuzi does not fight like a warrior. He weeps, runs, hides, and clings to kinship and ritual. The focus is not on triumph, but on helplessness, on the terror of being hunted, on the collapse of safety beyond the city wall. Inanna barely appears. Her name surfaces only when Dumuzi calls on her brother for help. The central figure of loyalty and resistance is Inanna, who refuses bribes even when threatened, and whose grief becomes a weapon that fails. Other versions of the tradition make her ordeal even harsher, describing her being abused and tortured in order to force a betrayal, yet still refusing to speak. That contrast sharpens the shame of the friend who gives Dumuzi away. The narrative seems designed to place devotion beside treachery, to frame the sister as the true, steadfast heart of the story. A different myth handles Dumuzi's death from another angle and gives Inanna a larger role. Here, she is not absent from events, but a young wife at home, waiting, uneasy, convinced something is wrong. She longs for her husband's return from the steppe where he tends livestock. A dark report arrives instead. A robbery has taken place, and Dumuzi has been struck down. The killer is linked to a formidable old woman named Bilulu and her son Girgir. The cattle and grain taken from Dumuzi's holdings are carried into Bilulu's house, and the deed is described as blunt, violent, and final. Inanna's first reaction is not immediate despair. She assumes the returning figure must be her husband or someone acting under his command, because Dumuzi was known for guarding his animals day and night. That pride collapses when the truth becomes unmistakable. The husband is gone, and another man now drives the stolen herd. Inanna turns from anxiety to vengeance. She travels out into the desert windlands to confront Bilulu. The story is damaged in places, but the direction is clear. Inanna reaches Bilulu's domain and delivers punishment. The scene shifts to a tavern where Inanna climbs onto a seat like a judge and speaks a curse that reshapes the culprit's fate. Bilulu is doomed to become a waterskin used in the desert, a low and practical object, and Bilulu and her son are assigned a strange afterlife as protective spirits of the wasteland. Another Eyrie being tied to that desert windland is sentenced to roam and keep account whenever offerings are made. The curse is not only revenge, it sets up a system of remembrance. Whenever someone in the desert pours water or sprinkles flour for the dead, the spirits associated with Bilulu must call out the ritual words, commanding libation and sprinkling, forcing the memory of Dumuzi to rise again at the very place where he vanished. The killers are turned into unwilling servants of commemoration. They must honour the one they destroyed. This detail may reflect real desert custom, travellers and herders making simple offerings to the dead, with water and flour, the most basic gifts possible in a harsh landscape. In the story, every such act becomes a hook that pulls Dumuzi's presence back into the world of the living for a moment. Inanna's revenge is therefore double-edged. It punishes, but it also secures a kind of continuing care for her husband's spirit, ensuring that he is not left without sustenance or remembrance. These accounts leave a final set of questions hanging in the air. Why was Dumuzi marked for death at all? Why did the hunt feel ordained? Why were underworld forces involved? Why did a shepherd who is sometimes called a king run instead of fighting? Why could neither marriage nor divine connection protect him? The traditions do not answer immediately because their purpose is not neat explanation but emotional impact. The terror of pursuit, the loyalty of a sister, the bitterness of betrayal, and the heavy reality that young men could be taken suddenly, leaving families to mourn and perform rites that try to repair what cannot be repaired. After the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the political landscape of southern Mesopotamia shifted once again. Cities that had long traditions of power, especially Uruk and began to recover their influence. During this time, Sumerian culture experienced a powerful revival, a period modern historians describe as the Neo-Sumerian era. Ancient traditions, language, religion, and royal ideology re-emerged with renewed strength, shaping the identity of the region for generations. At the center of the Sumerian religious world stood the god Enlil. His main sanctuary was located in the sacred city of Nippur, and he was regarded as the supreme authority among the gods. Yet the moment when Enlil rose to this dominant position remains uncertain. It may have occurred long before the Akkadian period, but the origins of the god himself remain debated. Some traditions present him as deeply rooted in Sumerian belief, while others suggest that his worship may have entered the region from the north. Clues from earlier rulers hint that Enlil's authority had already been firmly established. Even before the age of Sargon of Akkad, a king of Mari referred to himself as the governor of Enlil, showing that the god's prestige had spread widely across Mesopotamia. This rise of Enlil raises another question. Did his prominence weaken the position of the powerful goddess Inanna? The evidence suggests that the situation was more complex. Although kings acknowledged Enlil as the highest divine authority, Inanna continued to play a crucial role in royal ideology. Earlier rulers had dedicated statues to her temples, and the bond between kings and the goddess remained deeply embedded in the traditions of power. In literary texts describing the fall of Akkad, Enlil appears as the divine judge who condemns the empire and brings about its destruction. However, these compositions were written after the events themselves and reflect the political views of later Sumerian rulers. They present Enlil as the ultimate authority whose decisions determine the fate of kingdoms. The city of Nippur already possessed its own ancient patron deity, Ninurta. When Enlil rose to supreme status, the traditions of the two gods were woven together. Ninurta was reimagined as the son of Enlil, and several myths originally connected to Ninurta gradually became associated with his father. Through these adjustments, the religious structure of the pantheon remained stable while Enlil's authority expanded. In royal hymns, a new theme appeared. Enlil was portrayed as the god who granted kingship to earthly rulers. Yet Inanna's influence did not disappear. She remained the divine partner of kings and the source of prosperity and fertility for the land. Even when Enlil was acknowledged as the supreme deity, the kings continued to celebrate sacred unions with Inanna in her temples. A new political power soon emerged in the city of Archaeologists refer to this ruling line as the third dynasty of because earlier traditions claimed that kingship had been granted to that city 3 separate times. The rulers of this dynasty may have originally come from Uruk, and with them they brought the powerful cult of Inanna, the city goddess of their former homeland. 5 kings ruled during the century of this dynasty's existence. Their government created an extensive administrative system that organized resources across a large territory. Taxes in the form of grain, livestock, and other goods were collected from distant regions and transported to central storage centers. From there, the state redistributed supplies to officials, temples, and workers. These rulers also maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. Royal daughters were married into foreign courts to secure alliances, while merchants travelled across long trade routes. Ships sailed through the Persian Gulf toward Dilmun, a prosperous trading centre located on an island. From there, merchants continued toward Magan and beyond, reaching distant lands known for precious stones and rare materials. No other period in Mesopotamian history produced such an enormous number of written records. Thousands of clay tablets survive from this time. Many of them document administrative details, but the kings also encouraged the production of literature. Writing was taught in schools known as the Houses of Tablets. Some teachers instructed students in private homes, while others worked in institutions supported by temples or the royal court. King Shulgi in particular established numerous schools where scribes copied texts and learned the art of writing. Much of the Sumerian literature known today was preserved during this period. This creates a distorted picture of earlier history, because rulers often reshaped traditions to suit their own political needs. They commissioned hymns that praised their achievements and emphasized their relationship with the goddess Inanna. In these poems, the king appears as her beloved partner, and their ritual union was celebrated as a sacred event that guaranteed the prosperity of the land. One of the earliest rulers to rise after the collapse of Akkad was Utu-Hegel of Uruk. His reign was defined by conflict with the Gutians, a mountain people who had moved into Mesopotamia from the eastern highlands. In royal poetry, Utu-Hegel describes how he drove these invaders from the land. The poem presents the conflict as a divine mission. Enlil, described as the king of all lands, entrusted Utu-Hegel with restoring order to Sumer. The Gutians were portrayed as destructive outsiders who had disrupted the balance of society, seizing power and spreading violence across the country. Before launching his campaign, Utu-Hegel turned to the goddess Inanna, the patron deity of Uruk. He addressed her as a fierce warrior and asked for her support. According to the poem, Inanna accepted this role, encouraging the king in his struggle. The citizens of Uruk gathered behind him, inspired by the belief that both Enlil and Inanna stood on their side. The narrative even links Utu-Hegel to legendary heroes of the past. Figures such as Gilgamesh appear in the story as symbolic allies, strengthening the king's claim to divine favour. Whether these events occurred exactly as described is uncertain, but the poem reveals how rulers used mythic imagery to legitimize their authority. Utu-Hegel's triumph was short-lived. After only a few years, he died during a military campaign. Power then passed to Ur-Namma, who moved the royal residence from Uruk to the city of Ur. Under his rule, Ur became the center of a flourishing kingdom. Ur-Namma expanded his influence across southern Mesopotamia and adopted the title King of Sumer and Akkad. His reign is remembered for prosperity and construction projects. Trade routes flourished, canals were dug to irrigate farmland, and the fields produced abundant harvests. One of his most famous achievements was the construction of the great ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Nana. Monumental architecture like this symbolized the connection between the king and the divine world. Reliefs show Ur-Namma offering libations to the gods, presenting himself as their devoted servant. In royal hymns, Ur-Namma claimed descent from legendary figures of Sumerian tradition. Heroes such as Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh were presented as his ancestors. The goddess Ninsun, who in myth was the mother of Gilgamesh, was described as his mother as well. Through these stories, the king positioned himself within a sacred lineage. Another element of royal ideology was the sacred union with the goddess Inanna. In poetic descriptions, the king enters her sanctuary and shares her bed. This ritual symbolized fertility and prosperity for the entire kingdom. The well-being of crops, animals, and people was believed to depend on this divine relationship. Despite these favorable omens, Ur-Namma's life ended suddenly during a battle against the Gutians. His death shocked the kingdom. The event was explained in a lamentation describing how, the gods had altered their earlier decision about his fate. According to the poem, his mother mourned endlessly while fields withered and livestock died. The wounded king was carried from the battlefield to the city of Ur, where he died in the arms of his wife. Soldiers accompanied his body to the grave with tears and ceremonies. His burial involved a boat that was ritually sunk after being stripped of its equipment, recalling earlier royal burials in the same region. In the Poetic account, the dead king journeys to the underworld carrying gifts for the gods who dwell there. After presenting these offerings, he is granted a position of authority among the dead, sharing the responsibility of judging spirits alongside legendary figures such as Gilgamesh. Back in the world of the living, mourning continued. His widow lamented that the king would never again see his children grow or hold them in his arms. The poem portrays grief not only as a private sorrow, but as a disruption of the entire kingdom. Another explanation was given for why the goddess Inanna had not prevented the tragedy. According to the story, she had been sent away on a mission at the moment when Enlil changed the king's fate. When she returned and learned what had happened, she reacted with fury, shaking heaven and earth in anger. Eventually, she accepted the decision of the gods but promised that Ur-Nammar's name would never disappear. His achievements would be remembered through canals, cities, and fertile lands that bore witness to his rule. After Ur-Nammar's death, his son Shulgi ascended the throne. His reign lasted nearly half a century and marked the height of Neo-Sumerian power. He reorganized the administration of the state and strengthened diplomatic and economic networks across the region. Shulgi also cultivated an exceptionally close relationship with the gods. Like his father, he claimed descent from mythic ancestors and described Inanna as his divine spouse. In later years, he took an unprecedented step by declaring himself a god during his lifetime. From that moment, his name was written with the symbol that marked divine status. Royal hymns from his reign describe military victories against the Gutians and the support he received from numerous gods. Ninsun was portrayed as his mother, Lugalbanda as his father, and Gilgamesh as his brother. Other deities such as Enki, Utu, and Nanna also appeared as protectors of the king. In these poems, Shulgi is depicted as a formidable warrior who crushed enemy armies and devastated hostile territories. Fields were burned, cities destroyed, and foreign lands reduced to desolation. After returning victorious, he visited the temples of the gods who had aided him and presented them with spoils of war. Another hymn describes his arrival in the city of Uruk, where he visited the sanctuary of Inanna. Dressed in ceremonial garments, he entered her temple accompanied by priests and offerings. The goddess is portrayed as admiring him and preparing herself for their sacred union. Through this ritual, she confirmed his destiny as ruler of the lands. Royal propaganda during Shulgi's reign sometimes reached extravagant levels. One famous hymn claims that the king ran the distance between the cities of Nippur and Ur, and back again in a single day, despite storms and heavy rain. Whether or not such feats were real, the stories emphasized his strength and divine favor. Other texts describe his miraculous birth. According to the narrative, the moon god pleaded with Enlil for a son, and the divine decision resulted in the birth of Shulgi, destined to rule. Scholars often interpret these accounts as political propaganda meant to reinforce the legitimacy of the dynasty after the sudden death of Ur-Namma. The rulers who followed Shulgi attempted to continue the traditions he established. Amar-Sin inherited the throne, but ruled only briefly, leaving behind little literary record. His successor, Shu-Sin, faced growing pressure from the Amorites, groups that were moving into Mesopotamia from the western regions. To slow their advance, Shu-Sin ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall stretching across the landscape between two rivers. Despite this effort, the barrier failed to stop the migration, and the stability of the kingdom began to weaken. During the reign of the final ruler, Ibbi-Sin, famine and warfare devastated the country. Grain shipments failed to reach the capital, perhaps because officials withheld supplies or because the roads had become too dangerous. Hunger spread across the land and many people abandoned their homes. At the same time, armies from the eastern kingdom of Elam invaded the region. They eventually captured Ibbi-Sin and carried him away into exile. With this event, the third dynasty of Ur came to an end. A new dynasty later emerged in the city of Isin. Its rulers presented themselves as heirs to the traditions of Ur, even though their territory was smaller. They continued the old rituals and maintained the sacred bond between kings and the goddess Inanna. One of these kings, Idindagan, composed a remarkable hymn celebrating his connection with the goddess. In the poem, Inanna appears as the brilliant star of the evening sky, identified with the planet Venus. Surrounded by musicians, dancers, and priests, she moves in a grand procession while the people of the land celebrate with feasts and offerings. As night falls and the star rises above the horizon, couples unite in love across the land. The abundance of nature reflects the favor of the goddess. Animals settle into their resting places. Fields flourish, and the population gathers in joyful celebration. On the festival of the New Year, a ceremonial bed is prepared in the temple. The king approaches the goddess in the role of her divine partner. Through their symbolic union, she grants him authority and prosperity for the coming year. The following morning, the king appears before the people seated upon a throne beside the goddess. Music, feasting, and celebration fill the palace as the population witnesses the renewal of divine support for the kingdom. Exactly how this ritual was performed remains uncertain. Some traditions suggest that a priestess represented the goddess, while others propose that the ceremony involved a statue or symbolic performance. Whatever the details, the hymn presents the sacred marriage as a powerful expression of the connection between divine forces and royal authority. Royal authority in ancient Mesopotamia was not communicated through words alone. Hymns praised kings and proclaimed their greatness, but visual imagery carried the same message with equal power. Long before the second millennium, rulers had already understood how images could shape political ideology. One famous example comes from the Akkadian ruler, Naram-Sin, whose monumental stone relief portrayed him climbing a mountain in a pose associated with the sun god. Through such imagery, he presented himself as a figure who stood between humanity and the divine. Later, rulers continued this strategy. During the second millennium, royal propaganda spread through small but powerful objects, cylinder seals. These carved stones were rolled across clay to create impressions that functioned as official signatures. At the same time, they carried carefully controlled imagery that expressed the ideology of kingship. The range of scenes used on these seals became surprisingly limited, suggesting that the royal court strongly influenced what designs could be used. The images were not random decorations, but part of a broader political language. Among the most revealing images are scenes often called presentation scenes. These depict a subordinate official approaching the king in a formal audience. The arrangement of figures shows clearly how authority was understood. The king sits on an elevated throne placed upon a platform. His position is physically higher than that of the servant, emphasizing hierarchy and distance. The servant never sits. He stands respectfully before the ruler, his posture humble and restrained. The servant's appearance also follows strict conventions. His hair is cut short and his clothing is simple, usually a fringed cloak with one corner folded over the shoulder. His right hand is lifted toward his face in a gesture of respect that appears frequently in Mesopotamian art. This gesture signaled submission and loyalty. The entire scene communicates the message that the king occupies a level far above ordinary people. Approaching the king was never portrayed as a casual meeting. In many seals, a divine figure leads the servant forward. A goddess often takes the official by the hand and introduces him to the ruler. Behind the servant, another divine being may appear. A protective goddess, whose raised hands indicate prayer and protection. The audience, therefore, takes place within a sacred atmosphere rather than an ordinary political setting. Even the throne itself carries symbolic meaning. On some seals, the king's seat is supported by legs shaped like those of a bull. Above the scene, a crescent symbol may appear, representing the moon god. These details transform the royal audience into an event that exists partly within the divine sphere. The king sits like a figure who shares in sacred authority. The inscriptions carved into the seals also follow a clear formula. They usually begin with the name of the reigning king and his titles. Next appears the name of the seal's owner, followed by his official role and sometimes the name of his father. The inscription ends with a declaration of loyalty that identifies the owner as the servant of the king. Through this language, the seal openly acknowledges the hierarchical relationship between ruler and subordinate. Some seals contain a longer statement, indicating that the king himself granted the seal to its owner. These examples were typically reserved for high officials or members of the royal family. Simpler seals declaring only loyalty belonged to servants of lower rank. In this way, the seals themselves reflected the structure of the court and the distinctions within it. The distribution of seals was therefore more than a practical administrative tool. Receiving a seal meant receiving authority delegated by the king. The official who owned the seal could act in the ruler's name. Because kingship itself was considered sacred, this authority carried a divine dimension. Through the seal, the servant became a participant in the royal order established by the gods. The imagery on the seals strengthens this interpretation. The king appears seated on a throne in a manner similar to depictions of gods in Mesopotamian art. In scenes where deities receive worshippers, the divine figure is recognizable by a horned crown and special garments. In the royal presentation scenes, the king does not wear the horned crown, but he still resembles a divine judge sitting before those who approach him. Scholars have suggested that these images connect the king with the sun god, who served as the supreme judge of the cosmos. From the heavens, the sun observed everything that occurred on earth. Because of this all-seeing power, the sun god became associated with justice. Kings adopted this symbolism, presenting themselves as earthly counterparts of the solar judge. In royal inscriptions, rulers sometimes describe themselves using solar imagery. A king might be called the true son of his land, or the one who judges the world with perfect fairness. Through such titles, the king presented his rule as a reflection of cosmic order. Earlier depictions of the sun god show him rising between mountains at dawn. Flames burst from his shoulders, and in his hand he carries a saw-like instrument used to divide or cut decisions. The act of cutting symbolized judgment, the separation of truth from falsehood. This tool represented the divine authority to determine fate. On royal seals, however, the king does not carry the saw of the sun god. Instead, he holds a small object that scholars often describe as a cup. Only the king holds this object. Gods depicted beside him do not. Its exact meaning remains uncertain and has been debated for years. Some researchers once linked the object to banquet scenes, known from earlier art where participants drink from cups during ceremonial feasts. Yet the object in royal scenes looks different and is held in another way. Others proposed a connection with rituals used for predicting the future. where drops of oil were placed on water and interpreted by priests. But the size of the object in the king's hand appears too small for such a purpose. Another possibility is that the object is not an ordinary cup, but a symbolic miniature made of metal. In this interpretation, the object represents royal authority rather than a practical tool. The king would display it as a sign of the sacred office he possessed. Whether cup, token, or emblem, the object appears to represent the power entrusted to the ruler by the gods. Divine approval was essential for kingship in Mesopotamia. No ruler could claim legitimacy without the support of the gods. One important method used to discover the will of the gods was the practice known as extispicy. In this ritual, a priest sacrificed an animal and carefully examined its internal organs, especially the liver. The patterns found there were interpreted as signs left by the gods. This practice was not unique to Mesopotamia. Similar methods appeared in many cultures across the ancient world. In later centuries, the Romans adopted comparable rituals from earlier traditions in Italy. Clay models of livers discovered in Mesopotamian cities reveal how priests studied these signs. Each section of the model represented a possible omen that could guide interpretation. Whether the earlier Sumerians used this exact technique remains uncertain. The surviving texts describing liver divination are written in Akkadian rather than Sumerian, suggesting that the practice may have developed later or alongside other forms of divination. Understanding the will of the gods was considered essential because the universe operated according to powerful cosmic principles. Among the most important were the divine forces known as the Me. These represented fundamental powers governing aspects of civilization, such as kingship, justice, craftsmanship, and social order. According to myth, these forces originated in the deep waters of the Abzu and were guarded by the god Enki. Stories describe how the goddess Inanna obtained these powers and brought them to the city of Uruk. Through them, she exercised influence over culture and authority. During the later Neo-Sumerian period, another concept became increasingly important: the idea of fate decisions known as Nam-Ta. These decisions were associated especially with the god Enlil. The difference between these concepts was significant. The Me were viewed as ancient cosmic principles that had existed since the beginning of creation. Fate decisions, on the other hand, could be determined at specific moments. The gods gathered at particular times to establish destinies for the coming year, the coming month, or even the coming day. Because these decisions could be determined repeatedly, priests and rulers believed they might influence them through ritual. Offerings, prayers, and ceremonies were performed in hopes that the gods would decide in favour of the king and the kingdom. One important moment occurred at sunrise. As the sun emerged from the underworld and rose into the sky, the gods were thought to assemble and determine events for the day ahead. At that moment, the king entered the temple and presented offerings. Standing in a designated place, he raised his head toward the sun god, seeking direct attention from the divine judge. The ritual described a symbolic exchange. The king looked upward while the god cast his gaze downward. Once this sacred connection was established, the king's question could be asked. The answer would then be revealed through the interpretation of signs in the sacrificed animal. While the king sought guidance from the gods, he also represented them before his people. In ceremonies and imagery, he appeared as a reflection of the sun god's authority. When he sat upon a raised throne dispensing judgment, the scene echoed the daily rising of the sun that illuminated the world. Royal hymns often compare the ruler to the sun itself. Some kings describe themselves as the light of the land or the radiant judge who brings justice. Such language reinforced the idea that kingship existed within a sacred cosmic structure. The goddess Inanna retained an important role within this system of fate determination. Although Enlil came to dominate many aspects of divine authority, Inanna remained closely associated with the powerful forces known as the Me. In several hymns, she is praised as the mistress of countless divine powers. In these compositions, she gathers the sacred forces and holds them in her hands. She is portrayed as wearing them like ornaments, symbols of the authority she commands. Through these powers, she influences kingship, warfare, love, and prosperity. Some hymns describe Inanna sitting beside the great gods, while decisions about the world are made. The assembly of divine beings gathers around her while prayers rise from every land. In this setting, she participates directly in determining the fate of nations. Another hymn presents Inanna as a powerful judge, seated upon a throne in a great hall. Her seat rests upon lions and other powerful animals, symbols of strength and dominance. People approach her bringing livestock and offerings, while priests perform rituals around her. Within the temple complex, several special thrones were associated with the goddess. Some were described as places where fate decisions were pronounced. One was even called the Dais of Silence, a location connected with sacred judgment. These settings reinforce the idea that Inanna's role extended beyond love and warfare into the realm of cosmic authority. In addition to liver divination, other methods were believed to reveal the will of the gods. Some ancient traditions describe oracle games that used boards, pieces, and dice. These systems may have developed from earlier ritual practices. Certain boards discovered in royal tombs consist of squares connected by narrow paths and decorated with symbols such as rosettes. The results of throws determined how pieces moved across the board. Some positions were considered fortunate, while others predicted misfortune. These games may once have served as tools for divination before eventually becoming ordinary entertainment. Gaming boards appear widely across the ancient Near East and later spread to other regions. Although the exact rules are uncertain, the symbolic connection between chance and fate suggests that these games were originally linked to attempts to understand divine intentions. Alongside the great gods stood mysterious groups of lesser, divine beings, known as the Igigi and the Anuna. Their precise nature remains unclear, but they frequently appear in descriptions of divine assemblies where fate is determined. They stand respectfully, while the greater gods pronounce judgments and decide destinies. Some traditions describe them as witnesses to divine decisions, bowing and praying during the ceremonies. Others portray them as assistants, who help enforce the outcomes chosen by the higher gods. All of these elements formed part of the ideological system that supported kingship. Rulers claimed that the gods had granted them the powers necessary to govern. These powers, the Me of kingship, included authority, justice, and the right to rule. Royal hymns emphasize that these divine forces were given directly to the king. One composition describes a ruler approaching the temple of Enlil with offerings, seeking confirmation of his destiny. The god casts a favorable gaze upon him and grants him a throne that gathers all divine powers together. Another king declares that the goddess Inanna personally led him to the place where destinies are decided. There, she promised protection and lasting authority. Through such stories, the ruler's legitimacy was linked directly to divine will. The object held by the king on cylinder seals may represent this divine mandate. Displayed before his servant, it symbolizes the sacred authority entrusted to him. When the king grants a seal to one of his officials, the gift reflects more than personal favor. It signals participation in the cosmic order of kingship. The servant receives a role within that order, acting as the king's representative in the administration of the kingdom. Through this relationship, the divine structure of power extends outward from the throne to every level of society. Across the ancient cities of southern Mesopotamia, stories and songs told of the passionate union between the goddess Inanna and her beloved shepherd Dumuzi. Their relationship was never merely a tale of romance. It was a symbolic expression of fertility itself. In poetic language, their embrace represented overflowing harvests, flourishing flocks, and the renewal of life in the fields. Farmers depended on these cycles of growth for survival, and the prosperity of their crops and herds was closely tied to religious belief. Yet the king also depended on these same forces. A ruler's authority and stability were believed to rest not only on political power, but also on divine favour. For that reason, kings sought a special relationship with the goddess of love and fertility. Only she possessed the power to guarantee abundance, prosperity, and the continuation of royal authority. To secure her blessing, rulers visited her temples and participated in elaborate ceremonies celebrating fertility. These rites emphasized the generative powers of nature and were filled with imagery drawn from sexuality and reproduction. The symbolism was deliberate. Fertility rituals portrayed the same creative forces that farmers hoped would transform planted seeds into abundant harvests. The royal ceremonies echoed much older traditions that had long existed in rural communities. Long before large cities dominated Mesopotamia, villagers had already developed rituals intended to encourage the fertility of the land. Songs describing the love between the En priest and the Nin priestess were part of these early traditions. Over time, these songs evolved into royal hymns that celebrated the relationship between the king and the goddess Inanna. Ancient works of art reflect these ideas. Images on early ritual objects show ceremonial encounters between sacred figures under the protection of the goddess. These scenes likely symbolized agricultural prosperity and divine blessing. When the goddess favored the land, granaries overflowed and flocks multiplied. The origins of such rituals may reach back to the earliest agricultural communities of the Near East. As farming spread across the region thousands of years ago, people developed ceremonies intended to encourage growth and abundance. Many societies believed that imitating the forces of nature through ritual actions could help bring about the desired result. In many traditions, the fertility of plants was represented by symbolic marriages between male and female figures. Festivals celebrating springtime often included ceremonies that united these symbolic partners. In later European customs, traces of this ancient idea survived in celebrations involving figures such as the May Queen and May King, or seasonal bridal couples. When cities began to emerge in Mesopotamia, religious and political authority became increasingly intertwined. The ruler of the city gradually took on a more powerful role in public ritual. Instead of the earlier union between priest and priestess, the ruler now formed a symbolic partnership with the city's goddess. In this changing religious environment, the king was portrayed as the chosen husband of Inanna. Through this sacred union, he gained legitimacy and divine approval. The earlier priestess, who once participated in fertility rites, may have become associated with the temple god instead, serving as a ritual representative of the divine spouse. Meanwhile, the king assumed the ceremonial role that earlier belonged to the sacred couple of the village tradition. Songs once sung about the En and the Nin were adapted to celebrate the union between the ruler and the goddess. The king was now depicted as the earthly partner of Inanna. In performing this role, the king often identified himself with Dumuzi, the legendary shepherd who was the goddess's beloved. This association may seem surprising. In the myths, Dumuzi was not a triumphant hero, but a tragic figure pursued and killed by demons of the Underworld. Yet his connection with fertility was so important that the kings emphasized his role as Inanna's lover, while largely ignoring the darker aspects of his story. Dumuzi remained closely linked to the realm of the dead, and this association may have carried its own symbolic meaning. From the underworld he could still influence the cycles of life and rebirth that govern nature. In certain hymns, Dumuzi appears almost as a guide who leads the king to the goddess during the sacred union. Some poetic texts describe the goddess inviting her beloved to enter her house after he has been released from captivity. The imagery recalls earlier myths in which Dumuzi was seized by demons and taken to the underworld. In these songs, the goddess expresses longing for her returning lover and praises his beauty in vivid metaphors. His hair is compared to palm branches, his beard to precious blue stone, and his body to a finely crafted statue of gold and ivory. The goddess herself is described with equal sensuality. Their dialogue uses the same rich and playful imagery found in popular love songs sung during seasonal festivals. In these poems, the king, identified with Dumuzi, becomes the partner of the goddess in a sacred union. After their encounter, the goddess promises prosperity, victory, and long life. The language of these blessings is filled with imagery of brightness, celebration, and abundance. Sexual union in this context symbolizes the flourishing of the entire land. Inanna's body is often compared to fertile soil ready to be cultivated. The king becomes the farmer who prepares and nurtures this land. Through their union, crops grow, gardens flourish, and the deserts themselves seem to bloom. Other hymns use similar imagery. The goddess's breasts are compared to irrigated fields that nourish the land. Water flowing from them symbolizes the life-giving rivers that sustain agriculture across Mesopotamia. Modern scholars have often described this ritual relationship as a sacred marriage. The concept was later known in Greek tradition as a divine wedding between gods. In Mesopotamia, however, the situation was unique. The goddess Inanna was said to take a mortal shepherd as her partner, allowing human rulers to step into that role during ceremonial rites. Some kings openly described themselves as the goddess's husband. By doing so, they claimed divine favor and elevated their own status. Hymns celebrating royal achievements often speak in very direct terms about the king sharing the goddess's bed. Temples likely contained special ritual beds prepared for these ceremonies. In some traditions, the bed was decorated with fragrant plants and linen garments. The atmosphere of these rituals emphasized beauty, fragrance, and luxury. Royal hymns describe the king arriving at the goddess's temple bearing gifts and dressed in ceremonial garments. He presents offerings and enters the sacred chamber where the goddess awaits him. In poetic language, the king celebrates the beauty of the goddess, while she praises his strength and authority. Through this union, the king becomes the guarantor of prosperity for his people. The goddess grants him power to rule, promising that crops will flourish and flocks will multiply under his reign. Not every city followed this pattern. In some places, the ruler did not assume the role of the goddess's husband. Instead, the king arranged ceremonial marriages between the city's patron god and goddess. One famous example comes from the city of Lagash. There, the ruler organized an elaborate celebration for the divine marriage between the god Ningasu and the goddess Bao. The temple was decorated, offerings were prepared, and a sacred bed was arranged for the divine couple. Poetic descriptions portray Bao entering her chamber like a rising river, symbolizing the abundance she would bring to the land. When she sits beside her divine husband, the union results in prosperity for the entire region. Artists also attempted to represent these ideas visually. Fertility is an abstract concept, but ancient craftsmen used symbolic imagery to convey it. One powerful symbol was the scorpion. These creatures perform a distinctive courtship dance and can produce large numbers of offspring, making them a natural emblem of reproduction and fertility. On certain cylinder seals, two scorpions appear facing each other as if performing this dance. Between them shines an 8-pointed star, a common symbol associated with Inanna. Other seals portray human figures embracing beneath the same star. In these scenes, a king and goddess stand together, their union representing the blessing of fertility and success. Additional artworks show a goddess seated on the lap of a god. This gesture symbolized intimacy and union. Such images often appear alongside symbols of fertility, such as flowing water or young animals. In some cases, the figures may represent divine couples, such as the moon god and his consort. In others, they may depict rulers and their wives celebrating marital harmony. Banquet scenes on early seals also carry symbolic meaning. A man and woman sit facing each other, drinking from a shared vessel through long tubes. These images may represent not only celebration but also the harmony and abundance associated with marriage. The idea of divine union extended into many aspects of religious life. In some traditions, priestesses served as earthly counterparts to the divine wives of the gods. Yet the sacred union itself remained primarily a mythic event between the gods. Over time, the emphasis on the king personally uniting with the goddess began to decline. Later, literary works even treat the idea with skepticism. One famous story tells how the goddess falls in love with the hero Gilgamesh and offers him wealth, power, and glory if he will marry her. Instead of accepting, Gilgamesh refuses and lists the tragic fates of her previous lovers. His harsh response mocks the promise of divine romance and reveals a changing attitude toward the old tradition. Despite this shift, love poetry continued to flourish in Mesopotamia. Later songs preserved the sensual language and imagery of earlier hymns, though the king was sometimes replaced by ordinary lovers. These poems describe longing, desire, and the beauty of the beloved in vivid detail. The female voice often invites her partner to approach and share her bed, using the same metaphors once applied to the goddess herself. In later centuries, the sacred marriage ritual moved away from the king and returned to the realm of the gods. Temples celebrated the union of divine couples such as Nabu and Tashmetu, whose ceremonial meeting was reenacted through ritual performances. In these ceremonies, the goddess enters her chamber adorned with jewelry and fragrant oils. The god arrives to comfort her and promises to fulfill her wishes. Their union is believed to bring prosperity and harmony to the world. Similar rituals existed in other cities where divine couples symbolized the balance of cosmic forces. The king no longer acted as the goddess's husband, but still played an important role by offering gifts and supporting the ceremony. These traditions demonstrate how deeply the idea of sacred union shaped ancient religious thought. Even when the details changed, the central belief remained the same. Harmony between divine partners ensured the well-being of the land and the prosperity of its people. The ancient love songs celebrating Inanna and Dumuzi did not disappear with time. Their imagery continued to inspire poetry and ritual long after the earliest kingdoms had faded. Over generations, the stories were adapted, transformed, and preserved in new cultural settings. Among the poetic texts preserved from the ancient world, few are as striking as the biblical composition known as the Song of Songs. This collection of Hebrew love poetry was likely written down during the late centuries before the Common Era. The work celebrates the passion between a young woman and the man she loves. Its presence within the Hebrew Bible has long puzzled readers, since the poem contains none of the prophetic warnings, laws, or historical narratives that characterize most other biblical writings. Instead, The text consists almost entirely of intimate love poetry. A woman speaks with longing for her beloved, praising his beauty and recalling moments of closeness between them. Her words describe desire, attraction, and emotional devotion with remarkable intensity. The tone is personal and sensual, focusing on the emotional world of the lovers rather than religious instruction. The poem unfolds through a series of lyrical scenes in which voices alternate between the young woman, her lover, and a group of companions often referred to as the Daughters of Jerusalem. Their responses encourage the lovers, celebrate their devotion, or marvel at the beauty of their relationship. The structure resembles a sequence of poetic dialogues, rather than a continuous narrative. At the heart of the poem stands the young woman often called the Shulamite. She expresses deep longing for the man she loves, praising his scent, his voice, and the joy she feels in his presence. She describes how the fragrance of perfumes and oils surrounds their meeting, and how love itself seems sweeter than wine. The lovers address each other in affectionate terms and compare one another to elements of nature. Trees, gardens, fruits, and flowers appear throughout the poem as symbols of beauty and desire. The beloved is compared to a flourishing tree whose shade brings comfort, while the girl describes the sweetness of his presence like fruit that ripens in the sun. The language of the poem is vivid and sensual. The girl remembers lying beside her lover, while the fragrance of spices fills the air. She compares him to clusters of blossoms growing in vineyards, and praises the beauty of his eyes and voice. In turn, the young man admires her appearance and compares her features to jewels and precious ornaments. Throughout the poem, images of gardens and fertile landscapes appear again and again. Their bed is described as surrounded by greenery, with cedar beams and fragrant wood. The setting evokes a world filled with life, growth, and natural beauty. The lovers are not given clear identities, and the poem does not explain the circumstances of their meeting. Instead, it presents moments of longing, reunion, and admiration. The Shulamite speaks openly of her desire, telling how she waits for the voice of her beloved and imagines his arrival from the hills. When she hears him approaching, the landscape itself seems to awaken. He appears like a gazelle leaping across the mountains. He calls her to rise and join him, announcing that winter has ended and spring has arrived. Flowers are blooming, birds are singing, and the land is filled with fragrance. Nature mirrors the emotions of the lovers. The arrival of spring represents renewal and awakening. The blossoming of plants and the ripening of fruit echo the awakening of love between the young woman and her beloved. At times, the poem turns inward and expresses the anxiety that accompanies desire. The girl searches for her lover through the streets at night, unable to find him. She wanders through the city, asking if anyone has seen the one her heart longs for. Eventually she finds him and refuses to let him go, leading him into her mother's house. Scenes like this emphasize emotional intensity rather than narrative continuity. The poem moves between dreams, memories, and imagined encounters. It captures the restless energy of love that searches, longs, and finally finds fulfillment. One striking feature of the Song of Songs is the absence of direct references to God. Unlike most biblical texts, the poem does not describe divine intervention or moral teaching. Instead, it celebrates human love with an openness that has fascinated readers for centuries. The only widely recognized figure mentioned in the poem is King Solomon. His name appears several times in passing references to royal splendor. In one scene, a procession approaches from the wilderness, surrounded by clouds of perfume. It is described as the carriage of Solomon, guarded by warriors and richly decorated with silver, gold, and purple cloth. The daughters of Zion are invited to look upon the king wearing the crown given to him on his wedding day. The moment is presented as a joyful celebration filled with admiration and festivity. These references to Solomon may have played an important role in the poem's later history. By associating the work with a famous king renowned for wisdom and wealth, later readers could view the poem as worthy of inclusion in sacred scripture. Yet the poem itself does not present Solomon as the central character. The primary focus remains on the unnamed lovers. Their dialogue and expressions of affection form the heart of the work. The question of how such a sensual poem became part of the Bible has intrigued scholars for generations. Some have proposed that the text reflects ancient fertility traditions that were once connected with ritual celebrations of love and renewal. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, songs describing the union of lovers were often connected to broader themes of fertility and seasonal change. Similar imagery appears in earlier poetic traditions from Mesopotamia, where myths and hymns celebrated the relationship between divine figures associated with growth and prosperity. Certain motifs appear in both traditions. Shepherds, vineyards, gardens, and blooming fields are central images in these earlier songs as well. Lovers describe one another using comparisons drawn from nature and agriculture, emphasizing sweetness, fragrance, and beauty. The beloved in the Song of Songs is sometimes portrayed as both shepherd and king, an unusual combination that echoes earlier poetic traditions in which a divine or royal figure embodies both roles. The shepherd tends flocks in the countryside, yet is also described with the grandeur of a ruler. Many metaphors also appear strikingly similar. Fruits, such as grapes, pomegranates, and apples, symbolize love and fertility. Aromatic substances like myrrh and nard evoke sensual pleasure and luxury. Gazelles and deer represent grace and vitality. The poem also includes lines that resemble phrases known from earlier love poetry of the ancient Near East. In one passage, the girl longs for her lover's embrace, wishing that his arm would support her head while the other holds her close. The image conveys both tenderness and passion. These expressions of desire resemble the language found in much older love songs in which a goddess and her beloved speak to each other in similar terms. In those earlier poems, the relationship between lovers symbolized fertility and the flourishing of nature. In the Song of Songs, the young woman expresses her longing in ways that echo those traditions. She compares her lover to trees and gardens and invites him into landscapes filled with fragrance and fruit. The lovers imagine walking together through vineyards and orchards where the sweetness of nature mirrors their affection. Yet the poem itself contains no direct reference to ancient rituals. Instead, it appears as a celebration of human love, detached from explicit religious context. Later, religious interpreters offered another explanation. They argued that the poem should not be read literally, but symbolically. According to this interpretation, the lovers represent a deeper spiritual relationship. Within Jewish tradition, the poem came to be understood as an allegory describing the bond between God and the people of Israel. The passionate language of the lovers was interpreted as a poetic way of expressing divine love for the community. In this interpretation, the beloved man becomes a symbolic representation of God, while the young woman represents the people who seek his presence. The longing and reunion described in the poem reflect the spiritual relationship between the divine and the faithful. This symbolic reading allowed the text to remain within the canon of sacred scripture despite its sensual imagery. The poetic descriptions of love could be understood as metaphors for spiritual devotion. Other scholars have suggested that the poem may have originated as part of popular song traditions. The structure of alternating voices resembles performances in which a solo singer is accompanied by a chorus. Groups of women may have sung these verses during festivals or celebrations. Such songs could have been performed during weddings or seasonal gatherings, where music and dancing were common. Over time, these popular songs may have been collected and eventually written down. Festivals in the ancient Near East often combined religious rituals with communal celebration. People gathered to eat, drink, dance, and sing. Young men and women met in vineyards and fields, exchanging playful verses about love and attraction. In this lively environment, love songs could easily spread from village to village. Traveling musicians and storytellers may have adapted familiar themes to new audiences, allowing the songs to evolve over time. Elements of older poetic traditions may have survived within these popular songs. Imagery that once belonged to ancient fertility rituals gradually became part of everyday romantic poetry. As centuries passed, these songs were preserved because of their beauty and emotional power. Eventually, they were recorded in written form and attributed to famous figures such as Solomon. The imagery found in the Song of Songs reflects this long cultural continuity. Mountains, gardens, walls, and vineyards appear as recurring motifs. Birds sing in blossoming trees while lovers admire the fragrance of fruit and flowers. Jewelry and precious stones symbolize beauty and devotion. The woman adorns herself with ornaments, while the man promises to decorate her with gold and silver. Such imagery was common in ancient love poetry across the Near East. Even celestial imagery appears within the poem. One verse compares a woman's radiance to the dawn, the moon, and the sun. Such comparisons evoke the brilliance of the morning star rising in the sky. These poetic expressions reveal how ancient symbolic language could pass from one culture to another, adapting to new religious and literary settings, while retaining familiar imagery. The shepherd lover, the blooming fields, the sweet fragrance of fruit and spices, and the longing of lovers searching for each other all echo themes that have been part of Near Eastern poetry for thousands of years. Over time, the original religious context of these images faded, but the emotional resonance of the poetry remained. The songs continued to be sung and remembered because they spoke to universal experiences of desire, longing, and devotion. Eventually, these ancient verses found a place within sacred scripture. Their presence there reflects not theological instruction, but the enduring human fascination with love and beauty. Among the many titles attributed to the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna, one of the most frequently discussed is the Sumerian expression often rendered as "new gig of heaven." For generations, scholars translated this phrase in a highly specific way, claiming it meant something like sacred prostitute of heaven or hierodule of the sky god. Yet this interpretation has increasingly been questioned. A closer examination of the language and its usage in ancient texts suggests that the title was not intended to describe prostitution at all. Instead, the expression appears to emphasize the goddess's exalted authority and purity as a sovereign figure connected with the heavens. In this sense, the title highlights her cosmic importance rather than any association with sexual commerce. This issue is not limited to one title alone. A number of other descriptions of Inanna and related female roles in Mesopotamian society have historically been translated with similar assumptions. Terms such as car kid and its Akkadian counterpart harimtu were repeatedly rendered as prostitute or temple prostitute. Likewise, the names of priestesses and religious women known from cuneiform records were routinely interpreted as labels for sacred prostitution. Words referring to temple women such as Entu, Naditu, Lukur, Ugbabtu, Istaritu, Kadishtu, Kulmashitu, Shugitu, and Kezertu were often placed into this same category without strong textual justification. in the ancient love poetry connected with the goddess and her consort Dumuzi. These terms appear in contexts that do not resemble prostitution at all. In one poetic exchange, Dumuzi presents shining stones as gifts for the goddess, and the text praises their beauty as they adorn her body. In the dialogue that follows, the word nugig is used simply to describe the goddess as Dumuzi's bride. When later interpreters translated the term as temple prostitute, they unintentionally turned a celebration of divine love into something very different. The implication that the goddess herself was being called a prostitute reflects modern assumptions more than the meaning of the original language. For a long time, scholars imagined that the ancient cities of Mesopotamia were filled with sacred prostitutes connected to temples. Taverns were even translated as brothels, and the goddess of love was described as presiding over an enormous system of ritualized sexuality. This image became so widespread that it appeared almost unquestionable. Yet when the actual texts are examined carefully, the evidence turns out to be far less clear. One of the earliest sources often cited to support the idea of sacred prostitution comes from a Greek historian who visited Babylon centuries after its great cultural peak. In his writings, he described what he claimed were strange customs of Babylonian society. Among these stories is a vivid description of a marriage market in which young women were supposedly auctioned off to potential husbands. According to the account, the most beautiful women were sold first, while the money collected from these auctions was used to provide dowries for those considered less attractive. The same writer also described a supposed ritual in which every woman of Babylon was required once in her life to sit in the temple of the goddess of love and wait for a stranger to throw a coin into her lap before having sexual relations with him. Only after completing this act, he claimed, could she return home and continue her life normally. Although this story has often been repeated, many historians have pointed out serious problems with it. The same author also claimed that Babylon had no physicians and that sick people were placed in public squares so strangers could offer medical advice. This claim is known to be false because Babylonian medical texts demonstrate a sophisticated medical tradition. If the account of doctors is inaccurate, it raises questions about the reliability of the story about temple prostitution as well. Biblical writings later contributed to the negative image of Babylon as a place of moral corruption. In prophetic visions, the city appears symbolically as a figure called the Great Harlot, representing decadence and spiritual danger. These religious texts were not intended as historical descriptions of Mesopotamian society, but their powerful imagery reinforced the idea that Babylon was associated with sexual excess. Modern scholars have attempted to test these old assumptions by studying the surviving cuneiform documents in detail. Thousands of administrative tablets record economic transactions, temple activities, and everyday life. If large systems of temple prostitution had existed, it would be reasonable to expect that some trace of them would appear in these detailed records. One researcher investigated tablets discovered in the ancient city of Kish. These documents mention groups of women called kezertu, who were supervised by temple officials and involved in certain ritual activities. Because the women were connected to temple administration, some scholars quickly concluded that they must have been prostitutes working for the temple. Yet the tablets themselves never describe sexual services or prostitution. The documents simply refer to payments related to unspecified duties. The nature of these activities remains uncertain. Another set of records from the city of Sippar reveals a similar situation. In the archives of temple personnel, there are references to ritual operations carried out by both men and women. These rites are named in the texts, but their exact meaning is unclear. Some historians again interpreted the terminology as evidence of prostitution. However, the tablets themselves do not mention sexual behaviour. In fact, certain rites associated with the same terms were performed exclusively by men, which complicates the assumption that they referred to prostitution. Adoption contracts from the city of Dumuzi have also been used to argue that prostitution existed as an organized profession. These contracts describe arrangements in which women adopted daughters under specific conditions. In some translations, the documents appear to allow an adoptive mother either to marry off the girl or to have her work as a prostitute. Yet this interpretation depends entirely on translating the word harimtu as prostitute. If the term has a different meaning, the conclusion changes completely. Another line of argument comes from the famous epic of Gilgamesh. In the story, the wild man Enkidu is brought into human society by a woman named Shamhat. She sleeps with him and teaches him about clothing, food, and civilization. Because she seduces Enkidu, many translators labelled her a prostitute. Yet the text itself never describes her occupation in those terms. Instead, she functions as a civilizing figure who introduces the wild man to human culture. After Enkidu later falls ill and realizes that he is dying, he curses Shamhat for bringing him to the city. His angry speech describes a harsh destiny for her, imagining a life on the margins of society. However, when the sun god reminds him of the kindness she showed him, Enkidu withdraws his curse and replaces it with blessings. He wishes that powerful men will admire her and give her precious gifts. Even here the language reflects social imagery, rather than proof of a profession. Because the word harimtu appears in literary texts, some historians assume that it always referred to prostitution. Yet, a closer examination of legal and social documents reveals a more complex picture. In many cases, the term seems to describe a woman who lived independently outside the authority of a father or husband. In ancient Mesopotamian society, most women belonged to a patriarchal household, either as daughters or wives. A woman who did not belong to such a household occupied a unique legal category. These independent women could pursue various occupations. Some worked in temples as musicians, singers, or ritual specialists. Others operated taverns, served as midwives, practiced magic or healing arts, or engaged in trade. The surviving records demonstrate that women participated in many professions unrelated to prostitution. When ancient poets described the goddess Inanna herself with the term harimtu, they were not calling her a prostitute. Instead, they were emphasizing her independence. Unlike most women in society, she was not subordinate to a husband. She stood outside the normal structure of patriarchal authority. Legal texts from Mesopotamia reveal how these social categories were enforced. In certain periods, strict dress regulations distinguished married women from unmarried women in public spaces. Married women and daughters belonging to a household were required to wear veils when they appeared outside. Independent women, such as harimtu, were forbidden to veil themselves. The law treated the veil as a visible symbol of belonging to a household, protected by male authority. Some temple women lived in cloistered communities. Among them were the naditu, women who often came from wealthy families. They did not marry and usually remained childless. Many of them controlled property and conducted financial transactions, such as lending silver or managing land. Because they lived outside traditional family structures, later interpreters sometimes labeled them prostitutes. Yet the historical evidence indicates that they were bound by vows of chastity and performed religious or economic functions, rather than sexual ones. A legal provision from the Code of Hammurabi mentions that certain temple women, who were not living within cloister walls, could not open or enter taverns. Earlier, scholars interpreted this law as a prohibition against prostitution, assuming that taverns were brothels. However, taverns in Mesopotamia were social and commercial centres where business deals were negotiated. The law likely aimed to limit economic competition between independent temple women and male merchants. Over time, the range of occupations available to women in Mesopotamia became narrower. In earlier centuries, records mention female scribes, physicians, and artisans. In later periods, these roles gradually disappeared from the documentation. Social restrictions increased, and marriage became the dominant expectation for women's lives. Economic hardship may have pushed some women into prostitution, but this does not mean that prostitution defined the social categories described in earlier texts. Literary compositions sometimes portray the goddess of love in exaggerated and humorous ways. One ancient poem depicts young men boasting about their desire for the goddess and imagining extravagant encounters with her. The tone is playful and provocative, reflecting the fantasies of youthful storytellers rather than religious doctrine. Later readers occasionally mistook such satire for literal descriptions of cult practices. Debate among modern scholars continues. Some researchers argue that temples must have organized prostitution because the goddess of love was associated with sexuality. Others counter that the documentary evidence does not support such claims. Administrative tablets from major temples contain thousands of economic records, yet none clearly describe temple-run brothels or income from prostitution. In recent years, a growing number of historians have concluded that many earlier translations were shaped by cultural assumptions. Words describing independent women were interpreted through the lens of modern ideas about sexuality. When these terms are examined in their social and legal contexts, they often reveal a very different meaning. The world of ancient Mesopotamia was complex, and the roles of women within it were varied. Some women were priestesses, musicians, business managers, healers, or ritual specialists. Others lived independently outside the authority of a household. Still, others served in royal courts or temple institutions. Their lives cannot be reduced to a single stereotype. The enduring image of the temple prostitute has proven remarkably persistent in popular imagination. Yet the surviving evidence suggests that this picture may say more about later interpretations than about the realities of Mesopotamian society. What emerges from the texts instead is a society in which women occupied many different positions, some powerful, some vulnerable, and many still difficult to understand across the distance of thousands of years. If the love poetry describing the relationship between Inanna and Dumuzi was not originally composed by temple prostitutes, another question emerges. What role did these songs play in Sumerian society? And how were they understood by the people who preserved them? Some of the poems may have been connected to the ritual known as the sacred marriage, a ceremony in which the king symbolically united with the goddess Inanna inside her temple. In this ritual, the king represented the divine shepherd Dumuzi, and the union was believed to secure prosperity for the land. Certain hymns associated with specific rulers show signs of being carefully composed by trained scribes who worked within palace administrations and scribal schools. These scholars produced formal religious texts praising the king and linking his authority with divine favour. Yet many of the love songs involving Inanna and Dumuzi feel very different from these official compositions. Their tone resembles the traditional songs sung in villages during seasonal festivals and wedding celebrations. Instead of presenting the goddess as a distant celestial ruler, the poems portray her as a young woman preparing for marriage. Dumuzi appears not as a divine figure of cosmic power, but as a bridegroom approaching the house of his beloved. Several features suggest that these songs may have originated in oral traditions. The verses are short and rhythmic, often repeating the same lines or refrains. Such patterns are typical of songs intended to be performed aloud, possibly by groups of singers responding to one another in alternating voices. The structure suggests a communal performance rather than a formal literary composition. The scenes described in these songs focus on familiar moments surrounding marriage. Inanna prepares herself for her wedding night, bathing and dressing carefully before meeting her bridegroom. The marriage has been arranged with the approval of her family, and relatives assist in bringing the two lovers together. Dumuzi arrives carrying gifts, approaching the house where his future bride waits in excitement and nervous anticipation. These scenes reflect experiences familiar to ordinary people. The emotions described are those of young couples preparing for marriage, not the distant rituals of royal temples. Although the characters bear the names of gods, their behaviour resembles that of villagers celebrating weddings and family unions. In these songs, the lovers address each other with affectionate titles such as king or goddess. These expressions function as romantic compliments, rather than literal claims of divine identity. Rural communities often used such playful language in love songs, elevating the beloved through poetic exaggeration. Most of the compositions are written from the perspective of the female voice. The goddess speaks directly, expressing anticipation, desire, and curiosity about the life she will share with her husband. Through her voice, the songs reveal the emotions of a young bride entering a new stage of life. The preparations for the wedding night receive special attention. The bride bathes and perfumes her body with fragrant oils. The bed is carefully prepared and decorated with sweet-smelling plants and clean linens. Honey and other symbols of sweetness appear frequently, emphasizing both pleasure and abundance. Sumerian poetry often relied on words that carried multiple meanings. A single expression could refer simultaneously to emotions, body parts, or hidden erotic imagery. This playful ambiguity allowed poets to create verses that sounded innocent on the surface while suggesting deeper layers of meaning. Many of the songs portray the marriage in terms drawn from everyday agricultural life. Dumuzi brings gifts connected with farming and herding. Milk, butter, wool, grain, and fruit appear repeatedly as symbols of wealth and prosperity. The bride herself sometimes worries about practical matters, asking whether her husband's household will provide security and comfort. In some songs, playful arguments appear between the lovers. Inanna questions the social status of Dumuzi's family, while Dumuzi insists that his background is worthy of respect. He promises that she will be honoured in his household and will not be burdened by domestic labour or family disputes. The details surrounding their marriage vary from song to song. In different versions, the lovers appear to have different parents. The preparations for the wedding change, and the gifts brought by the bridegroom are not always the same. These inconsistencies are typical of folk traditions that develop across many communities over long periods of time. Such features suggest that the songs may not have been composed originally by palace scribes. Instead, they likely circulated for generations as popular wedding songs and seasonal chants. Only later were they recorded on clay tablets and preserved within scribal schools. The exact moment when these songs entered written tradition remains uncertain. Oral traditions rarely leave clear traces in historical records. Yet it is possible that the songs were preserved because they reflected a central concern of Sumerian society: the fertility of the land and the prosperity of agriculture. In an agricultural culture, the success of crops and livestock determined the survival of communities. The symbolic union of Inanna and Dumuzi represented harmony between the forces of nature that produced abundance. Through poetic imagery, the songs expressed hopes for healthy flocks, fertile fields, and generous harvests. Even kings believed that the blessing of the goddess could ensure prosperity for the kingdom. By participating in rituals connected with the goddess of love and fertility, rulers hoped to secure divine favour for their lands and people. The imagery used in these poems often comes directly from farming and herding. The beloved is compared to flourishing trees, orchards, and fertile gardens. Inanna describes her body using metaphors drawn from fields waiting to be cultivated. Hair grows like fresh plants, and the earth itself becomes a symbol of fertility and growth. In many songs, Dumuzi represents the vitality of livestock and dairy production. Milk and butter flow in abundance when he is present. Yet the prosperity of animals and fields depends equally on the presence of the goddess. When she enters the cattle pens, the animals thrive and produce rich wool and milk. The songs, therefore, carried more than romantic meaning. They were believed to possess ritual power. Farmers, priests, and rulers alike could interpret them as symbolic expressions of cosmic fertility. Most surviving tablets containing these poems date to the period following the powerful Neo-Sumerian kingdoms. Many were discovered in houses that functioned as scribal schools, where teachers trained students in the art of writing. Pupils copied older texts repeatedly as part of their education. These schools likely preserved traditional songs that had been known for generations. Even after political institutions collapsed and many cultural traditions faded, scribes continued to copy the ancient lyrics. Through their efforts, the songs survived long after the spoken Sumerian language had disappeared. Archaeological discoveries from the same period reveal another intriguing phenomenon. During the centuries when these love songs were being copied, large numbers of terracotta plaques were produced throughout Mesopotamia. These small relief images were inexpensive and could easily be reproduced from molds. Unlike royal monuments, these objects were not intended for temples or palaces. They were placed inside ordinary homes, often in small domestic shrines. Families displayed them above doorways or near household altars. The plaques depicted a wide variety of images. Some showed musicians playing instruments. Others portrayed protective spirits or divine figures associated with fertility and prosperity. Among the most recognizable images was the goddess Inanna holding a staff while standing upon a lion. Such images were believed to carry protective power. The presence of a divine figure inside the home could guard the household against misfortune and attract blessings. A protective spirit placed near the entrance might ward off harmful forces. Many plaques also depicted scenes with explicit erotic imagery. These images display a direct and unapologetic representation of sexual activity. Rather than hiding erotic themes, the reliefs present them openly, much like the language of the love songs associated with Inanna and Dumuzi. Some modern interpreters have suggested that these plaques advertised brothels. Yet this explanation may reflect modern assumptions more than ancient realities. Sexual imagery in ancient cultures often had symbolic meaning connected to fertility and prosperity. Two major types of erotic images appear repeatedly. One shows a couple lying together on a bed, gazing into each other's eyes in an intimate embrace. The other depicts a sexual position in which the woman bends forward while drinking beer through a straw from a large vessel as the man stands behind her. These scenes resemble themes found in the love songs. In one context, Inanna appears as a young bride, preparing for marriage. In another, she appears as a powerful figure of sexual attraction, associated with taverns and social gatherings. Some plaques clearly depict beds, similar to those described in the wedding songs. These images evoke the same atmosphere of fertility and celebration that surrounds the poetic descriptions of marriage. In ancient society, fertility was closely connected to survival. Successful harvests and healthy families depended on the forces of nature. The goddess of love played a central role in this system because sexual union symbolized the renewal of life itself. In certain hymns, the goddess is described as bringing harmony to households. When she favors a family, work proceeds smoothly. Women weave cloth while men plough fields and the household prospers. When she withdraws her favor, conflict arises and families fall into disorder. The erotic imagery of the plaques may therefore have functioned as a symbolic invocation of fertility and well-being. By displaying such images in their homes, families may have hoped to attract the same blessings that the sacred union of the gods represented. A number of poetic texts describe physical experiences with remarkable directness. One ancient love song depicts a couple sharing a bed prepared with honey. The language suggests intense passion and emotional closeness between the lovers. By the second millennium, a noticeable shift appears in both the songs and the visual imagery. Erotic themes remain prominent, but they increasingly emphasize the magical power attributed to sexual activity rather than the agricultural fertility of earlier traditions. Plaques from this later period often portray scenes in taverns where drinking and sexuality are closely linked. Beer, widely consumed in Mesopotamia, appears frequently in these images. The combination of alcohol and erotic imagery suggests a belief in the energizing power of both. The tavern itself held a special place in Mesopotamian culture. Its name originally referred to the house or temple associated with the divine spouse. In everyday life, it became the gathering place where people drank beer, talked, and socialized. Beer played an important role in ritual and everyday life. Brewing required a careful process involving grains, spices, and fermentation. The drink was consumed through long reeds or straws placed into large jars. Some magical rituals concluded with a visit to the tavern. After performing ceremonies intended to avert bad omens, individuals were instructed to bathe, change clothing, and then enter a beer house. There, they would mingle with others and touch certain brewing vessels as part of the purification process. The fermentation vats in taverns were believed to absorb harmful influences. By touching them, a person who had undergone ritual purification could symbolically transfer remaining impurity into the brewing vessel. In this way, the tavern became not only a social space but also a place of ritual cleansing. The goddess of love was naturally regarded as the patron deity of these establishments. Her presence was believed to influence both emotional and physical states. Incantations sometimes invited her to enter the tavern so that prosperity and joy would fill the place. Owners of taverns performed rituals to attract her favor. Offerings of incense, sweets, and dust collected from thresholds were presented to the goddess, in hopes that she would bless the establishment. The aroma of beer and honey was thought to please her. Beer itself was associated with relaxation and desire. Ancient literature often describes drinking as the prelude to romance. Yet beer also served many other purposes. It appeared in medicinal remedies, magical potions, and offerings poured to the gods. Because the goddess was believed to influence matters of love, people frequently invoked her when facing romantic difficulties. Magical specialists, known as exorcists, performed rituals intended to restore affection between lovers or attract new partners. Some incantations attempted to rekindle the interest of a former lover. Others sought to cure sexual disorders or restore physical potency. These spells combined symbolic language, ritual gestures, and the invocation of divine power. In certain cases, animals associated with fertility were included in the rituals. Their behavior served as a model for restoring vitality. The goal was to stimulate strength and desire in the patient. Objects discovered in temples also reveal how individuals appealed to the goddess, for help. Small figurines, jewellery, and symbolic representations of body parts were offered as gifts. Among these were triangular plaques, representing female anatomy and small models of phalluses. Such objects may have symbolised hopes for fertility, marital harmony, or protection from illness. Some were made of precious materials, while others were produced from inexpensive enamel, so that ordinary people could afford them. The practice of offering symbolic body parts to a deity appears in many ancient cultures. In the case of the goddess of love, such offerings expressed prayers for sexual health, family stability, and the continuation of life. Magical practitioners known as exorcists played an important role in these rituals. They combined mythological references with practical techniques in order to influence the unseen forces believed to shape human life. Some texts describe elaborate ceremonies lasting several days. Participants recited dramatic speeches, performed symbolic gestures, and invoked powerful deities. Through these performances, individuals hoped to change their fate and overcome personal crises. In a society where marriage determined economic security, jealousy and rivalry could create intense fear, certain rituals were designed to protect marriages from infidelity or to drive away romantic rivals. Long before the rise of classical civilizations, stories about the goddess Inanna circulated widely across Mesopotamia. Among them, one tale became especially famous: her descent into the underworld. Versions of this story existed in both Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, preserved in temple libraries and copied by scribes for centuries. Yet the narrative itself leaves many mysteries unresolved. It never clearly explains why the powerful goddess chose to enter the land of the dead. Like many ancient myths, the motives of the gods remain hidden, leaving later generations to interpret their meaning. In this story, Inanna does not appear as the triumphant goddess of battle, celebrated in royal hymns. Instead, she faces humiliation, suffering, and even death. Some scholars have suggested that this portrayal reflects changing religious ideas during the second millennium BCE, when new deities were gaining prominence and older traditions were being reinterpreted. The underworld belonged to Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal, ruler of the realm of the dead. According to mythic tradition, the god Enlil had divided the universe among the major powers of the cosmos. Heaven belonged to the sky god An, the earth to Enlil himself, and the dark world beneath the earth was given to Ereshkigal. Inanna, despite her influence, received no new domain from this division. Ironically, the underworld had once been associated with her movements in the sky, since the planet Venus, which represented her, regularly disappeared beneath the horizon. The myth begins with a decisive act. Inanna resolves to descend from the heavens to the underworld. Before setting out, she prepares carefully. She leaves behind the temples where she was worshipped across the cities of Sumer, and gathers the sacred powers known as the divine Me. These mysterious attributes symbolized authority, order, and the roles that define the world of the gods and humans. Inanna dresses in ceremonial splendor for the journey. She places a headdress upon her head, adorns herself with jewels of lapis lazuli, and wears the garments of a queen. Around her eyes, she applies dark cosmetics associated with attraction and desire. In her hands, she carries a measuring rod and line, symbols of divine order and authority. Before departing, she gives instructions to her loyal servant, Ninshubur. If Inanna does not return after several days, Ninshubur must mourn for her and appeal to the great gods for help. The servant must lament publicly, perform ritual gestures of grief, and seek assistance first from Enlil, then from the moon, god Nana, and finally from the god Enki, who possesses knowledge and the power of life. With these preparations complete, Inanna begins her descent. she arrives at the gates of the underworld and demands entry. The gatekeeper, named Neti, is surprised by the arrival of a goddess, who willingly approaches a realm from which no traveller returns. Suspicious of her intentions, he informs his queen. When Ereshkigal hears that her sister stands outside the gates, she becomes uneasy. She senses danger in Inanna's arrival. Nevertheless, she orders the gatekeeper to allow the goddess to enter, but only under strict conditions. The underworld is protected by 7 gates. As Inanna passes through each one, the gatekeeper removes a piece of her clothing or jewellery. At every stage, she asks why she must surrender her possessions. Each time, the same answer is given. The laws of the underworld demand it. One by one, the symbols of her power disappear. Her crown is taken away. Her necklaces are removed. Her sacred garments are stripped from her body. By the time she reaches the final gate, she stands completely exposed and powerless. In this state, she enters the throne room of Ereshkigal. What happens next is described differently in surviving versions of the myth, but the outcome is clear. The judges of the underworld condemn Inanna. Their gaze is described as deadly, their words filled with anger. She is struck down, transformed into a lifeless body, and hung upon a hook like a corpse. For 3 days and 3 nights the goddess remains dead in the realm below. Meanwhile, in the world above, Ninshuba waits anxiously. When Inanna does not return, the faithful servant carries out the instructions she had received. She mourns publicly and seeks help from the great gods. Enlil refuses to intervene. Nanna also declines. Both argue that Inanna sought powers that belong only to the underworld. According to the laws of the cosmos, anyone who claims those powers cannot return. Only the god Enki agrees to help. Using the dirt beneath his fingernails, Enki fashions 2 strange beings and sends them into the underworld carrying the water and plant of life. He instructs them to approach Ereshkigal with sympathy rather than confrontation. They find the queen of the underworld in a state of anguish and suffering. Following Enki's instructions, they echo her cries and share in her sorrow. Moved by their compassion, Ereshkigal offers them a reward. Instead of accepting wealth or land, they ask only for the body hanging on the hook. Bound by her promise, Ereshkigal reluctantly agrees. The 2 beings sprinkle the lifeless body with the water and plant of life. Inanna rises again. Yet her return is not without consequence. The laws of the underworld demand balance. If someone escapes death, another must take their place. Demons accompany Inanna as she leaves the underworld, determined to claim a substitute. As they travel through the world above, the demons attempt to seize several individuals. Each time Inanna intervenes when the person shows genuine grief for her fate. Loyal followers who had mourned her are spared. Eventually they encounter her husband, Dumuzi. Unlike the others, he is not dressed in mourning. Instead, he sits proudly upon a throne, clothed in magnificent garments. Inanna looks upon him with anger and delivers a devastating command. The demons seize Dumuzi and drag him toward the underworld. Later traditions soften this harsh judgment. In some versions, Dumuzi's sister offers to share his fate, allowing him to return to the world of the living for part of the year. This arrangement reflects a deeper symbolic meaning connected to seasonal cycles. Many ancient thinkers believed the myth described celestial movements. Inanna, associated with the planet Venus, periodically disappears from the sky when the planet passes close to the Sun. During this time, Venus becomes invisible for several days before returning again. Other interpretations connect the story to agriculture. Dumuzi represents vegetation and fertility. His death reflects the dying of crops at the end of the growing season. His return symbolizes renewal and the rebirth of life when the rains return and fields begin to grow again. Across Mesopotamia, rituals and songs mourned the death of this young god. Women in particular performed laments, crying out for the fallen shepherd and calling for his return. These ceremonies took place during the hottest months of the year, when vegetation withered under the relentless sun. Such traditions spread far beyond Mesopotamia. In Syria and later in the Greek world, similar rites developed around a figure known as Adonis. Like Dumuzi, Adonis was a beautiful youth whose death was mourned by women each summer. Festivals reenacted his passing and celebrated his eventual return. Through these myths and rituals, ancient societies expressed a profound truth about the cycles of nature. Life emerges, flourishes, fades, and returns again. The story of Inanna and Dumuzi captures this rhythm in dramatic form,